This is Bloomberg Surveillance with Tom Keene and Paul Sweeney.
Donald Trump needs a weak dollar.
Have we achieved a soft landing? Has the Fed kind of done its job?
With Lisa Mateo on markets.
The economic calendar jam-packed today.
And Michael Barr with news.
Fears over a broader regional war in the Middle East.
The best in economics, finance, investment, and international relations. This is Bloomberg Surveillance on Bloomberg Radio.
Good morning, everyone. Tom Keene, Paul Sweeney, Michael Barr. It is a shattered Washington, a horrific plane crash we've been following through the evening. Our Anne-Marie Horton and team down at the Potomac River with the details here. The sun is rising at 7:16, and Paul, at 7:30, the mayor and other worthies will brief us.
Yeah, Mayor Bowser in Washington, D.C. will brief us on this crash in D.C. And again, it's just some tragic news, Tom, to wake up to in our nation's capital.
Our goal here, besides a terrific news flow, and we believe we're getting to John Stolfus here on his bull market call, but within the tragedy and all that's going on in Wall Street, we're going to try to meld it in for you today. For our global audience, and particularly for the YouTube audience, I hope to really give you an understanding of what in America is affectionately called DCA, which is the Reagan National Airport. Paul and I live on airplanes, Paul even more than I do. We want to give you a little bit of the scope and scale around this horrific incident. And of course, we'll give you updates as we go to 7:30 and Mayor Bowser's treatment. We say good morning to all at 99.1 FM in Washington. Let's do this with split futures here, red and green on the screen, the VIX 16.10. It is still Bloomberg Surveillance with our interactive brokers, Bloomberg Business Flash, always steady, Lisa Mateo.
And we've got futures trying to battle back this morning after stocks took a hit yesterday. This was after the Fed kept rates steady, but also we had a handful of Mag 7 earnings. Apple next in line for today. So I want to start with tech-heavy NASDAQ futures. They're up about 0.5%, 107 points. S&P futures up 0.2%, 15 points. And we have Dow futures, little change, down about 10. Now I want to take you over to the Mag 7. So you have shares of Meta this morning. They're on the mend. They're up more than 1%. And this is after the stock originally fell in after-hours trading because they had disappointing sales for the current quarter. But that turning point was when CEO Mark Zuckerberg told investors Meta plans to spend hundreds of billions of dollars on AI infrastructure. Then we go to Tesla shares. Profit missed estimates, but word of plans to begin robo-taxi operations and forecasted sales recovery this year. That kind of made up for it. So its shares are up about 2%. But Microsoft lower, down 4%. The company says growth of its Azure cloud computing business, well, that slowed during the last 3 months of 2024. Apple, like we said, after the close, its shares down about 0.1%. That is your Bloomberg Business Flash. Paul and Tom.
Lisa, thank you so much. Oh, there we are. I got to get the light on there. Thank you so much, Lisa Mateo. What we'd like to do now to get our coverage started here, and Sid Phillip, we're so fortunate that he's in New York, usually based in London, on all of the airline industry and the many airports congested around the world, is talk to Nathan Hager amidst this tragedy about the magic that is DCA. Nathan, you come down the Potomac and Georgetown's on your left.
Right.
And they make that turn. It's extraordinary, isn't it?
Yeah, it just depends on which way you come in. Sometimes the beauty of Mount Vernon could be on your left if you're coming in from the south. But yes, it doesn't matter which way you come in to Reagan National Airport. Airplanes in this part of the nation's capital area, there are 3 airports, obviously, but for Reagan National Airport, they use the Potomac River as a flight path. And from what we understand, the videos that have come out of this explosion between the American Airlines regional flight and the Black Hawk helicopter, they could see it from the Kennedy Center. I mean, that's just a couple of miles north, right near Georgetown, as you mentioned. Everything is so close together. This airport is right across the Potomac River from the seat of power. And
the single runway, folks, is the most congested in America.
Yeah.
Paul Sweeney is expert on what we call EWR at Newark. And Paul, it's 30%. One runway at Newark, DCA's main runway, is 30% more busy than what you witness at Newark. It is. I can't convey enough to our global audience the congestion and the debate around this that we've seen. Nathan, let's look with the actual flight path of this American Airlines flight across a good part of Maryland and then down and pivoting at Mount Vernon, George Washington's landmark estate, and then coming up north across that big bridge. Take us in across the Potomac into runway 33.
Yeah, it comes right in from Maryland to your left, right along the Potomac River. Like I said, pilots use the Potomac River as their guide to come into Reagan National Airport. Georgetown is to the left, as David mentioned, who's David Gurrow's flown into Washington, D.C. so many times, used to live there. You see the Washington Monument. You see the Lincoln Memorial, the White House, Capitol Hill, all within view as you come into Reagan National Airport and make that turn to Mount Vernon to the south. It's an extraordinary view, but it shows you just how close this is to Washington, D.C. People who live, people who work in the nation's capital could have seen this explosion just outside Reagan National Airport to the north, right near the Kennedy Center.
Nathan, what will you listen for from Mayor Bowser here in 25 minutes?
I want to hear whether they've recovered the black box. I want to hear, just how they're going to be able to mount a search and rescue operation in the Potomac River, which is so cold right now after the snows that we got in Washington, D.C. I mean, it's getting milder now, but the Potomac is a very murky, very cold river right now. What kind of search and rescue operation, what kind of communication there was between the air traffic control, the airplane, and that military helicopter.
Leading our coverage at 99.1 FM, Nathan Hager, thank you so much. We welcome all of you across the nation and worldwide. We're going to give you some perspective on DCA, on the congestion at American airports. This has been hugely reported on over the last number of years. We'll have a number of experts step in, and of course, as we wake up across America, we're trying to get more true aviation experts to lend us perspective as well. We will again look at a busy business week, economics week on Wall Street after the Fed meeting. But right now, we're so advantaged to have the leader of our aviation coverage in from London with us in our studios in New York. Paul, it's good to have Sid here.
It really is. Sid Phillip, Global Aviation Senior Reporter for Bloomberg News, based in London, but here in New York. Sid, what do we know so far? We don't really see these types of incidents often here, certainly not in the U.S.
Yeah, this is the first deadly aviation incident in about 15 years in the U.S., and so it is something that's actually not very common. And we've seen that across the board in the U.S., we've seen sort of a couple of near misses in the recent years, but we haven't really seen an accident like this. And so this is a sort of sign that there is a sort of sometimes things go wrong with aviation. Yep.
You live this. In London, there's Heathrow, like CDG, and Dulles is an equivalent. But I stood at Gatwick years ago, and it felt like DCA. And Munich is heavily congested as well. Is there the near-miss tension in Europe like there is here? Sid Ember and Emily Steele at the New York Times have written two huge, lengthy articles on this near miss, that near miss, another near miss. Is it the same, Sid, in continental Europe?
It is. I mean, especially with single runway operations, it is very, very complicated. Gatwick's the busiest single runway operation in the world.
They have one airway. It's like out of the 1930s.
Wow. It is. And so it is. I mean, obviously, as there is more and more air traffic, it gets more and more difficult to manage the airspace, especially with the various sort of forms of transportation. And it's going to get even more difficult as we talk about eVTOLs and those vertical flying taxis. And so...
Oh, you're kidding me.
And drones
we
and
can't
all that
see,
stuff?
We can't see vertical flying taxis.
No. I mean, it is obviously going to be a very difficult situation, and there will be more pressure on regulators to try and ensure airspace safety.
There's a tension here, and I know the same tensions in London. I just saw Ryan Airways yesterday upset about something I can't remember in the exhaustion, but the tension that I see here is between airlines that want to do more business. Passengers at DCA, Reagan National, have gone from 15 million capacity. They're now crowbarring 25 million over like 10 years or so. But it's the airlines wanting to do more versus government institutions, to put a brake on it? Is that the right phrase?
It's more about capacity augmentation and essentially expanding capacity and making sure capacity can keep up with the demand. And that is where, because it takes years to put together a new runway. And in a lot of places, it's not possible because of the fact that airports are hemmed in by cities. And so it is something that just needs sort of pushback from regulators as regulators look forward at it.
What you do is, in Denver, you put your airport like 30 miles outside of the city in the middle of nowhere. You can build a big airport.
We don't need personal stories here, but I'm going to go to that, Paul. Yeah. My only, not near miss, but the only time I felt a Boeing aircraft take over the flight from the pilot was at Stapleton.
Yeah.
Years ago.
Yep.
And that's why they built Denver with those beautiful teepees out there on the horizon, is because Stapleton was as crowded as what we see. Sid, I know you've got to get back to team reporting here. To have Mary Schlangenstein in Dallas is our great advantage, and George Ferguson. Sid, thank you so much this morning. Really, really appreciate it as well. It is Paul Sweeney and Tom Keene this morning across the nation as we consider a horrific airplane accident. The videos from a distance, as I believe Paul mentioned, the Kennedy Center and others are terrible. Amory Horton is at the Potomac as the sun rises across Washington here in about 15 minutes. Paul, all I can say, and we talk about it both on and on the microphone here all the time. The congestion in Newport is like, I feel like I'm on an aircraft carrier.
Right.
And DCA is on steroids.
And I didn't really appreciate until you're reporting, Tom, about how crowded that space is there. And you just kind of wonder, our brave men and women in the military who are training or doing, are there other places they can do it other than in a congested commercial airspace? I don't know. I'll be interested to see the reporting on that in the coming days.
It'll be interesting to see the political debate in the coming weeks. Today is not the day for that debate, but it'll be really interesting to see how this works out. Again, we welcome all of you on your morning commutes across America. On YouTube, subscribe to Bloomberg Podcasts, and a particular good morning to those of you internationally here as we continue to look at this horrific accident at DCA, Reagan National in Washington. We will attempt to stagger to economics, finance, investment through the morning. It is a just incredibly busy time. Joining us now is John Stolfus of OPCO of Oppenheimer. We're thrilled that he could attend with a very optimistic call on America. John Farrell put out a tweet yesterday that showed X% of stocks flat to even lower, while a few stocks go up and away, like Facebook, Meta yesterday as well. Do you see any broadening out in the great Stolfus bull market?
Tom, first of all, our hearts are with those in the accident today in DCA, and then, but related to the markets, we see a broadening of the rally that had started up until we got this deep seek question, and then we saw a pullback. I mean, right now I think the S&P is still down about 1% from its January 23rd peak. The Nasdaq's down about 2%. But when you look at it, the trend is upward in the sense that we've got the Fed's doing the right thing, we believe. We're one of the few strategists who think that. Business and the consumers and job growth, resilient.
In the Fed meeting yesterday, I thought the most interesting debate was simply on real and top-line economic growth. Jan Hatzius and Goldman Sachs yesterday came out and shaved, I believe, Q4 under 2%. That's a bold call. I don't want to talk to John Stolfus, stock guy. I want to talk to John Stolfus, economist. Do you believe in a solid, resilient American economy forward?
I think the way I'd put it, it's a remarkably resilient, and I think that's been the case that has caused skeptics and bears a lot of agita over the course of since the rally began in the fall of 22. I think it was in October of 2022. After a really rough year, the rally began, and it persisted through 23 and 24. We think it carries through here. we've got that 7,100 target that was looking for about 17% upside from the point where we put it in December. It's reached closer to around an 18-20% kind of upside. But we think it's very possible. The years leading up to the tech bubble were about 4 or 5 years, as I recall, with remarkable performance from the S&P 500 as technology became a more important part of everyday life for both business and the consumer. And that's where we are, but it's about sharper virtual picks and shovels for both business and the consumer to deal with each other and deal with the data that is produced on a daily basis, which has grown exponentially in the last decade.
John, we heard from the Fed yesterday. I think the market's discounting maybe 1 or 2 rate cuts. So there's not a lot the Fed's going to do for us in 2025. It feels like earnings are going to have to be the driver for this market. How confident are you in the earnings for corporate America?
Well, so far, this fourth quarter earnings season looks pretty good. Last I looked on the EA page on my Bloomberg, it was 8 sectors positive earnings growth. 4 of those were double-digit earnings growth. Half were tech-related. The others were, as I recall, it was financials. And for the life of me at this moment, the last one I don't recall what it was. But the thing is, it's a mix of cyclicals and growth that are driving this, and we think it's it's not the trees grow to the sky. It's just that a market can climb a remarkable wall of worry in terms of dealing with all kinds of things.
I found fascinating yesterday, and my small brain can't remember who I was talking to. Lisa, has it been a blur the last 48 hours? It's been a blur the last 48 hours, particularly with this horrific crash. Somebody mentioned to me incremental 401k purchases. Mike Green, Simplified Asset Management. This goes back to my essay of the year 3 years ago, Lawrence McDonald, who walked through the wall of money that's just out there, relentlessly putting a systematic bid to the market. Do you buy that story?
We do, and we think it's not exuberance, but rather has to do with a fundamental thinking that I think has occurred in the private client group, which is that Social Security will simply not provide the same percentage of retirement income that it provided for boomers' parents and their grandparents.
So we're savings America.
I
think this is under discussed.
And it's one that frequently, whenever you get a boost in the 10-year yield, the bond crowd says, bonds are competitive with stocks. But on an intermediate to longer term basis, history tells us, past performance no guarantee of future results, that stocks indeed where to be.
Good morning, everyone. It is Bloomberg Surveillance from New York City this morning. Good morning to 92.9 FM in Boston, Bloomberg 1130 in New York, and a sleepless 99.1 in Washington. A horrific plane crash at Reagan National Airport overnight. I'm sure many of you are up to speed on this. We will continue with more information on it. In scheduled 12 minutes, the mayor of Washington will provide a press conference with various officials, responders, if you will, and we will, of course, bring you that coverage worldwide. Our goal here, folks, is to brief you on the crash, provide background of the aviation industry. We're working on guests on that, former pilots, engineers, former federal officials to speak to us about it. But we're thrilled to bring in here people like John Stolfus. Paul?
John, what are some of the sectors here that you're looking for in 2025? Again, we had, as you mentioned, 2 really strong years in the S&P 500 performance in 23 and 24. As you look to 25, are you looking for certain sectors to lead this market, or how are you thinking about it?
Well, we're looking at it from a perspective of, first of all, of sectors, and we think it continues to be information technology and communication services. Communication service as the old phone companies, but it's also got the streamers, the search engines, and it's got social media, and it's a big stuff for the AI story. But we're also looking at industrial sector, which is heavily embedded with technology, and financials and consumer discretionary.
You like the banks?
Well, we still like the big banks, and we think as interest rates are normalized, good for them.
It's not a day to say this, but John, you're killing it. Your call on the bull market has just been absolutely superb.
I'm very flattered.
John Stolfus, do I need a new Gretsch guitar?
I tell you, a penguin or
I think a penguin.
I think a penguin might be an extraordinary.
Thank you, Mrs. Keene. Good morning, Mr. Stolfus says I need a Gretsch penguin. You're dismissed, John Stolfus. Thank you so much for Dow S&P, I should say 7,000 as well. Red and green in the screen this morning with the VIX under 16, a 15 level here at 1.16.19. The yield space off the Fed meeting comes in a little bit. I always look at the 10-year real yield, 2.10%, middle tendency as well. We are 10, 11 minutes away from a first morning press conference in Washington with the mayor of Washington, D.C. and other first responders. We'll bring that to you to 99.1 FM and all across the nation. First, you need a briefing. Our Michael Barr.
Tom, thank you very much. An American Airlines regional jet collided with a military helicopter near Ronald Reagan Airport in Washington, prompting a search for any survivors in the Potomac River. Bloomberg's John Tucker has more on this horrific air crash.
Michael, American Airlines Flight 5342 from Wichita was on approach for landing at Reagan when it collided with a Sikorsky H-60 helicopter. That was around 9 p.m. Eastern. This is the controller in the tower at Reagan National.
I just saw a fireball and then it was just gone. So I haven't seen anything since they hit the river, but it was a CRJ and a helicopter that hit. I would say maybe a half mile off the approach end of 33.
On the ground, Harry Schulman was driving home when he saw the plane falling from the sky.
It was illuminated bright yellow underneath, and there was a spray of sparks on the underside of the plane.
The jet was carrying 60 passengers and 4 crew members. 3 soldiers were on board the helicopter. The first priority has been looking for survivors, however remote the chance of finding anyone alive at this point. A few minutes before the landing, air traffic controllers did ask the arriving commercial jet if it could land on the shorter runway 33. Less than 30 seconds before the crash, an air traffic controller asked the helicopter if it had the arriving plane in sight. The controller made another radio call to the helicopter moments later. Seconds after that, the 2 aircraft collided. I'm John Tucker, Bloomberg Radio.
Thank you very much, John. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., President Trump's pick to head the Department of Health and Human Services, faces a second day of confirmation hearings today. Yesterday, Kennedy came under fire from senators on his first day for his stance on vaccines. Senator Warren brought up the fact that he does make money with his vaccine skepticism. However, GOP Senator Roger Marshall of Kansas said he supports Kennedy's nomination to lead HHS.
He said, look, he supports vaccines. It's that simple. His own kids have been vaccinated. I think it's what's more important is for us to be talking about how we make America healthy again, and that's his mission.
Also, we will see confirmation hearings for Tulsi Gabbard, President Donald Trump's pick for Director of National Intelligence, and Kash Patel, Trump's nominee for FBI Director. Hamas-led militants freed 8 hostages today in the latest release since a ceasefire in the Gaza Strip took hold earlier this month. Israel is expected to release another 110 Palestinian prisoners. And again, our top story, we've been talking about it all this morning. An American Airlines regional jet collided with a military helicopter near Ronald Reagan Airport in Washington. According to NBC, at least 30 bodies have been recovered. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Michael Barr, and this is Bloomberg. Tom Paul, Lisa.
Michael Barr, thanks so much. From the Interactive Broker Studios, a Bloomberg Business Flash, Lisa Mateo.
And this Bloomberg Business Flash brought to you by Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer focuses the power of their thinking on you, creating customized plans to help achieve your goals. Put the power of Oppenheimer thinking into your investing, wealth management, capital markets, investment banking. This Business Flash, we're starting with futures. This is after the Federal Reserve. It kind of left those interest rates unchanged. Tech earnings pushing NASDAQ futures higher, so we'll start there. Up about 0.2%, 60 points. We have S&P futures up 0.1%, 8 points. Dow futures down 0.1% or 46 points. Now, we mentioned Meta, Tesla, Microsoft. I also wanted to point out IBM. Their shares up 8%. Forecasted strong revenue growth in the new fiscal year. Also a jump in AI-related bookings. Over to the 2-year yield, 4.19%. That's down 1 basis point. The yield on the 10-year, 4.49%, and that's down about 3 basis points. Now, we have other earnings out this morning. We have shares of UPS really taking a hit, down 11%. Its outlook disappointed, weak demand for its parcel shipments. And since we've been talking about the collision of a military helicopter, American Airlines flight last night near Washington's Reagan Airport, I just want to point out shares of American Airlines are off about 2%. We'll continue to keep you updated on the news flow with that story throughout the morning. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Lisa Mateo. That's a Bloomberg Business Flash. Paul and Tom.
Lisa, thank you so much. There is a sunrise in Washington this morning. It is a different sunrise. We see from the different networks and our internal cameras. One, boats still in a Potomac River, and it is such a shock, Paul, to see DCA silent and shut down here.
Shut down to approximately 11 a.m. Eastern time.
Into today. Originally, it was for tomorrow, but they're going to try to open DCA today.
Right. Yep. And
we'll get an update on that. We have imagery of a press conference to be held here with the mayor of Washington. It's scheduled in 5 minutes. We'll see on that as we can. We continue our coverage and welcome all of you on 99.1 FM in Washington and nationwide and worldwide as well, of course, on YouTube. We are going to do both efforts here today, economics, finance, investment, but also continue our coverage with Nathan Hager, Anne-Marie Horton, and our team in Washington. Rob Sockin joins us now, Citi Global Economist, on a very sober Thursday, to say the least. There's a suddenness that comes from these shocks. After the Fed meeting yesterday, what is the shock that's out there if we don't get the complacency everybody expects? There seems to be an incredible complacency of labor, of inflation, of GDP, and on, I dare say. What's the thing you worry about right now?
Yeah, absolutely. And as you said, right now, and you heard this from Chair Powell, things are looking pretty good. It looks like the labor market has stabilized after conditions were deteriorating for several months. We've had about 6 months of stabilization. Inflation's been more mixed, a few stronger prints, a few weaker prints. And I think there's a lot of uncertainty, of course, looming on how those are going to evolve, but then how Trump's policies are going to play on top of those factors.
That came up a little bit yesterday, Paul, didn't it?
Yep.
I mean, it was actually almost more than I expected.
Exactly. Yeah. So, Rob, what are the key drivers here? It seems like the labor market's strong. It seems like the Fed is moderately accommodating. What are the headwinds, if any, that you see for the U.S. economy?
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge right now is, as you said, things look pretty good. The consumer is still spending strong. That's supporting demand, which is supporting labor market conditions. And actually, the consumer looks to continue to be broadening out. It's not just services spending, it's goods spending now. So what I think really worries me is that overhang of uncertainty of what those Trump policies might look like, particularly on the tariff front. We've had a lot of noise in the first few weeks. We have a relatively modest expectation, I think, compared to others of what tariffs will ultimately look like. But that does loom large, and I think the more that uncertainty persists, the more that could weigh into business and consumer sentiment. But right now, it looks like a strong start into 2025.
All right, you're the global economist at Citi, and I can't think of a more global investment firm than Citi. Talk to us about kind of how the U.S. economy is positioned relative to our friends in Europe, in Asia.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, if you look at developed markets, you compare things like the U.S. to the Euro area, the U.K. I mean, the U.S. has just outperformed significantly in this cycle, particularly driven by that consumer strength that I mentioned, but also other factors like investment. And we're seeing more of the same. I mean, if you look at the Euro area numbers today, came in softer than expected. We're looking for another soft year from Europe in 2025, particularly if that tariff risk comes through. So I think relative to other developed markets, the U.S. looks very well positioned. And then emerging markets, I think most of them are going to hold up pretty well in 2025. The big risk, of course, is China, and again, comes back to that tariff risk.
We welcome all of you across the nation. Rob Sockin of Citigroup is with us here with a briefing after the Fed meeting. We will go to Reagan National Airport here in a bit for a press conference with Mayor Bowser and first responders. We will take that in its entirety. Paul?
Rob, talk to us about here in this U.S. economy. How are you thinking about just these tariffs? They seem to be top of mind every single day, and it's something I'm not sure investors have a good sense of how to factor that into maybe their economic outlook here?
This is the real challenge, and as I said, there's been a lot of noise almost daily since Trump returned to office about where the tariffs will be placed, how large they're going to be, and I think the challenge is, and we've done a fair amount of simulations on this, if you get things like large-scale tariffs, especially if trading partners retaliate, which would be very likely, you get pretty detrimental effects to the U.S. You get large hits to growth, you get boosts to inflation, and you get detrimental effects to the rest of the world. And I think we're all in wait-and-see mode to see just which countries, which goods are going to end up with these tariffs. Right now, we think a lot of the things you're hearing on Canada, on Mexico, are still mostly negotiation tactics. And like his first term, most of those tariffs are going to end up on China, which may be manageable at the end of the day. But that being said, he's been less harsh on China in his first few days than I would have expected. So I think for us, too, there's still a lot of uncertainty of how these things can evolve, especially with the amount of noise that we see each day. But one thing that's clear is that if we get into some type of tariff war, it's a negative for the U.S., it's a negative for the world.
The heritage of Citigroup and the melding of economics, I think of Catherine Mann and Willem Bouter and all the wonderful work you've done there, over to the equity market is signified by the late Tobias Lefkovich with a surprise index. And you've carried that forward. Meld your economics into this stunning bull market. What would you, I mean, to be honest, with great respect, what would Tobias say?
Yeah, and Tobias was wonderful. Had the pleasure of working next to him the first time I was at Citi many years ago. I would say that the data in the U.S. have continued to outperform, as we've said, and continued to surprise the upside. Enormous resilience. We've been growing above most estimates of trend in the U.S. And going into this year, you have scope for that story to continue to broaden. As I mentioned, consumers are broadening out their spending into good sectors. You could see more cyclicals perform well in that environment. And then I think the challenge again comes down to what does the policy environment look like? Our equity strategist team has written about if you get large scale tariffs in the U.S., that could be fairly damaging for equity markets. More narrow tariffs, probably manageable. You probably could still get increases in the S&P, but large scale would be pretty damaging. So I think again comes back to U.S. resilience, but that tariff risk still looms large even for the markets.
What's the China call here? I have no idea what the folks in China are doing. I don't know to believe the data. And assuming I do believe the data, is it a 5% economy? Is it something less than that?
It's really challenging. Right now we have a 4.2% for the year. That's a step down from 5% last year. And a lot of that is sort of domestic issues related to just structural factors weighing on consumer spending. But a big part of it is that we expect those sizable tariffs on China. We expect tariff rates to go up 10 to 15 points on China this year. That would weigh on growth fairly substantially. But there's also upside risk to the forecast. One, those tariffs could come in less than we expect, as mentioned. Two, you could get a larger fiscal response from Chinese authorities as those tariffs come into play. So I think a lot of uncertainty there. I think one thing, though, is it's not going to fall off a cliff, but I think it'll be slower than last year.
We are waiting the press conference of the mayor of Washington, D.C., Mayor Bowser, with a great tenure down there. Far longer than some of us understand, of 10 years, and she will have a press conference with first responders. We're waiting for it. We have imagery of this, and I think we're pretty close to it, and something that people are listening for. A distressing headline. Nathan Hager, thank you for this. This is newly appointed Walz, the congressman, here with his new duties for President Trump. Crash response moved from response to recovery. A difficult headline there. Before we hear from Mayor Bowser, we welcome all of you across the nation. We are commercial free in this important hour, and on YouTube as well. We say good morning across the nation, and particularly worldwide on YouTube, as we consider a horrific plane crash. And now let's go to the news conference. Now we're waiting. Well, we're waiting. There she's like Mayor Bowser setting up here. Mayor Bowser, of course, of the District of Columbia in Washington, D.C., with a substantial majority vote, is a Democrat. She is a native of Washington, D.C., and we will listen to her first comments as the sun rises in Washington.
Good morning. I'm Muriel Bowser. I'm the mayor of Washington, D.C. We are here at Reagan National Airport to provide an update on the tragic events of last night. I'm joined by U.S. Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy, D.C. Fire and EMS Chief John Donnelly, American Airlines CEO Robert Eisen, the Metropolitan Washington Airports Authority CEO Jack Carter, United States Senator Mark Warner, United States Senator Tim Kaine, U.S. Representative Don Beyer, as well as the Chief of the Metropolitan Police Department, Pamela Smith. And we are joined by first responders from across the Metropolitan Washington region. I speak for all of us when I say, and certainly all Washingtonians, how very sad we are for American Airlines, for the United States Department of Defense, and for all Americans for the loss of life that happened with the collision of these aircrafts. We know that includes families from across our region, as well as in Kansas and across the country. This morning, we all share in a profound sense of grief. I do want to thank the first responders who acted quickly last night, who ran towards danger, went into a very frigid river, and have worked throughout the night. Chief Donnelly reported in last night's briefing that we have a strong mutual aid agreement in our region, and those teams have worked together throughout the night in really tough and heartbreaking conditions, and we should all thank them for their heroic efforts. So we'll have several updates today. I'm first going to turn to the Secretary of Transportation, Sean Duffy, and then you will hear directly from Chief John Donnelly with a situational update.
We welcome all of you on 99.1 FM in Washington. Sean Duffy, the newly minted Secretary of Transportation, of course, formerly Wisconsin's 7th Congressional District. Let's listen.
You know that the Department of Transportation, the FAA, along with the White House, President Trump, local, state, and federal partners, all working together on this incident in unison. I couldn't be prouder of this team that's been assembled, working tirelessly. Mayor, I want to thank you specifically for your work. A few details I'd like to give all of you, and some of you reported this, but last night, if you live in the D.C. area, you would know that this was a clear night last night. The helicopter was in a standard pattern. If you live in the D.C. area, you'll see helicopters up and down the river. This flight pattern is seen oftentimes when you live in D.C. This was a standard flight pattern last night as well. The American Airlines flight coming into land was in a standard flight pattern as it was coming into DCA. So this was not unusual with a military aircraft flying the river and aircraft landing at DCA. And again, if you live in the area, you'll see that frequently with those two aircraft working together. As many of you have reported, we have located the two aircrafts. The fuselage of the American Airlines plane was inverted. It's been located in 3 different sections. It's in about waist deep water, so that recovery is going to go on today as that recovery takes place of the fuselage of the aircraft. NTSB is going to start to analyze that aircraft, partner with the FAA with all of the information we have to get the best results possible for the American people. I would just say that safety is our expectation. Everyone who flies in American skies expects that we fly safely, that when you depart an airport, you get to your destination. That didn't happen last night. And I know that President Trump, his administration, the FAA, the DOT, we will not rest until we have answers for the families and for the flying public. You should be assured that when you fly, you're safe. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary. Thank you, Mayor. I'm joined today with Fire Chief Bonnet from the Metropolitan Washington Airports Authority, and I'm John Donnelly, Chief of the District of Columbia Fire and EMS Department. Last night at 8:48, the control tower sounded an alert, which alerts responders to respond to a report of an aircraft crash on or near the airport. That sets off an immediate response from the Airport Authority Fire Department, from the District of Columbia and Metropolitan Harbor Patrol fireboats and other fireboats on the river in order to support that type of operation. Very quickly, this call escalated. It became apparent, the responders realized that they had a plane crash and immediately escalated to a response that ultimately included about 300 people last night. These responders found extremely frigid conditions. They found heavy wind. They found ice on the water, and they're operated all night in those conditions. I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the agencies that responded in addition to DC Fire and EMS and the Metropolitan Washington Airports Authority: Montgomery County Fire Department, the Prince George's County Fire Department, the Charles County Fire Department, the Baltimore County Police Department, the Anne Arundel County Fire Department, the Alexandria Fire Department, the Arlington County Fire Department, the Fairfax Fire Department, the Prince William Fire Department, the Baltimore City Police Department, the Maryland State Police, the Maryland Natural Resources Police, the Department of Defense, the Joint Base in Bowling Fire Department and the staff there, the U.S. Army, the U.S. Coast Guard, the United States Park Police, the Metropolitan Police Department, the FBI, and the NTSB. Despite all those efforts, we are now at a point where we are switching from a rescue operation to a recovery operation. At this point, we don't believe there are any survivors from this accident, and we have recovered 27 people from the plane and 1 from the helicopter. The District Office of the Medical Examiner has lead on reuniting these bodies and these people with their loved ones, and we will continue to work to find all the bodies and collect them and reunite them with their loved ones. We should also acknowledge that the Virginia Medical Examiner and the Army Medical Examiner are involved in this operation and a very important part of getting people identified. So,
Mr. Donnelly of the fire department.
Our hearts are certainly with all of the crew in American Airlines, and we'll hear from CEO Isom.
Thank you, Mayor. Good morning. I'm Robert Isom, the CEO of American Airlines. I want to express my sincere condolences for the accident that happened at DCA last night. We're absolutely heartbroken for the family and loved ones of the passengers and crew members, and also for those that were on the military aircraft. Our focus right now is doing everything that we can to support all of those involved and also the PSA Airlines team. This is devastating. We are all hurting incredibly. We urge any family and friends looking for information about their loved ones to call our designated helpline, and that's at 1-800-679-8215, 1-800-679-8215. And here's what I can share at this early stage. American Eagle Flight 5342, operated by PSA Airlines, traveling from Wichita, Kansas to Reagan National Airport, was involved in an accident just before 9 p.m. local time on final approach into Reagan National. It collided with a military aircraft on an otherwise normal approach, and at this time we don't know why the military aircraft came into the path of the PSA aircraft. Flight 5342, a CRJ 700, was under the command of 4 crew members. They carried 60 passengers, as you know, for a total of 64 people on board. In addition to local resources already here in D.C., American Airlines has activated our care team, and that's a group of specialists that are trained to support these types of responses. These team members are on site or arriving soon. And additionally, we have members of our GO team that are on ground here in D.C., and they're being deployed with resources to do everything that we can to take care of the needs of the families and the loved ones of the passengers and crew members. And that is our sole focus. And we're so grateful for the first responders. They've been working through the night, courageous efforts. And we're actively working with local, state, and federal authorities on emergency response efforts and closely coordinating with PSA Airlines as they cooperate fully with the NTSB on the investigation. I know that there are many questions at this early stage. I just won't be able to answer many, but we'll provide additional information as it comes. Thank you.
Mr. Isom of American Airlines.
I want to introduce the Metropolitan Washington Airports Authority CEO, Jack Carter. The authority manages Reagan, Washington National, and Dulles International.
Good morning and thank you, Mayor. First, let me begin by expressing our condolences for all the victims of this flight and for their families. There's a lot of grieving going on, and so we're very sympathetic to that. I want to echo what was said about the first responders. When there's a problem in this area, everybody drops everything and they rush to wherever the problem is. So I want to thank the chief, the entire team from Washington, D.C., but just as important, the list of folks that the chief described. The federal authorities have been here en masse, and so a lot of effort was brought to bear. Unfortunately, we weren't able to rescue anyone, but we are in the recovery mode right now. And I just want to, last night I expressed the fact that we hope to open at 11 o'clock today, and that is still the case. We're going to open the airport at 11 o'clock. And again, condolences to the families, and thanks to the many, many who are still out there working very, very hard to complete this recovery. Thank you, Mayor.
It is Bloomberg Surveillance.
I do want to acknowledge that the Virginia Transportation Secretary is here, in addition to the Alexandria Mayor. And I will like to ask members of the Virginia congressional delegation to the podium next. U.S. Senator Mark Warner, followed by Tim Kaine and Representative Don Beyer.
Among the worthies here at this press conference, of course, Tim Kaine.
I want to join with everyone else
Warner.
and express my condolences
Senator Warner
victims.
of Virginia.
For folks who don't live in the DMV, we are made up of a lot of jurisdictions. Reagan Airport's in Virginia. Across the river we have Maryland, obviously the district, but has been indicated by the chief, when tragedy happens, all those distinctions between the various jurisdictions and our federal partners all disappear. And I want to again thank all the first responders. On a personal note, I'll just add that literally I now know I was coming back from the district from a dinner to my home in Old Town Alexandria. And while I did not see the collision, I wondered, I'd never seen this many red lights streaming towards the airport and across the river in Maryland about this time. My phone started blowing up and I realized that this accident had taken place. There'll be a time to figure out, I know NTSB will have a briefing later in the day, but to the victims, our condolences. To the first responders, our thanks.
Sorrow, thanks, and questions. So sorrow, as all have expressed, to the crew, to the passengers, to the soldiers, to their
Senator
families,
Tim Kaine.
to their friends, to their loved ones, to people who are still trying to get information and unsure whether their loved ones have been lost. We offer our profound condolences to them and our sorrow for this tragedy. Thanks, I'll echo, Mayor, what you began with. When you see a challenge like this and you see people from so many different agencies, local, state, federal, with different uniforms, different badges, but working in such a coordinated way, even in the midst of a tragedy, it does give you a sense of appreciation and pride in people's willingness to come to the danger and work together. And I started to see that as a local official 30 years ago in Richmond, and definitely have seen it here. And then finally, questions. There are going to be a lot of questions, obviously, a lot of questions. And that's what the NTSB's job is to be an independent investigator of incidents like this. And they are here. We were in dialogue with them earlier today. They've been here since they got the alert, and they will be doing the work and playing lead in answering the many questions that we have. And that's as it should be. It's not a time to speculate. It's a time to investigate and get answers to the questions we need, and I have confidence that will be done. Thank you.
Tim Keene of Virginia. Again, Muriel Bowser.
Following up on the Senator, I think grief, thanks, and service, with millions and millions of Americans traveling every year, we are all grieving, knowing that it could have been our loved ones, it could have been us. And our hearts go out to all those who have lost folks. In a most partisan place, also, I'm really thankful that Democrats and Republicans, people from all over, have come together to try to make sure that people are served. As a local representative, I want the families to know that our office is available to serve you in any way we possibly can through this time of grief and transition and loss. And then also just note that we're deeply grateful for the people who risked their lives last night on a moment's notice and spent the whole night on the river in the ice and the wind, serving us. And then finally, as Senator Keene, Senator Warner noted, after the NTSB investigation, we've got to make sure that at the federal level and with the support of Virginia, Maryland, D.C., we're doing everything we can to make sure this does not happen again.
The congressman from Virginia, Don Beyer, of course, with his heritage there in business in Virginia. Again, Muriel Bowser, we welcome all of you
it's
nationwide.
Been said already that the National
YouTube
Transportation Safety Board becomes the lead agency in the investigation. Our jurisdiction in D.C., where the crash occurred over the river, concludes as we, in the leadership role of the Unified Command, as we shift to a recovery effort. We expect the National Transportation Safety Board to provide briefings to the press later in the day. So at this point, we can take a few questions. Yes.
Can you say without a shadow of a doubt that people are safe to fly?
What we can talk about today is what happened here with the collision of these vehicles. We've said what we know, and that the National Transportation Safety Board continues to investigate. I don't know that any of us have been briefed on anything that would suggest any other aircraft are implicated. Yes.
You're still missing 30 plus people in the water. What are some of the challenges in recovering them right now?
Chief.
So the rescue operation or the recovery operation goes on. It's a lot of touch and feel in the different parts of the plane or in the helicopter, and the crash area is a little spread out, so we've got some work to do. And I think it's a pretty normal type of situation. I don't think it's extraordinary.
How spread out is this debris field?
So the wind started blowing last night, so we've had debris travel from the airport down as far as the Wilson Bridge.
Mile-wise, how far is that?
I couldn't tell you.
Okay.
Less than a month.
This is a question for CEO Carter. You're going to open the airport at 11 o'clock this morning. How are you going to do that? And what impact is that going to have on operations, on passengers, on people's anxiety? How are we going to do this?
Well, we're going to open the airport at 11 o'clock. It's safe. We've worked with all the federal agencies, FAA, and it's been determined that we can open that airport safely. The recovery effort that's on our property is on the waterfront. Our primary runway, 119, will be open. It's away from any activity. We're going to have a secure area around that, so all are comfortable that we can get back to operations. Now, each airline will announce or communicate to their passengers what their operations are going to be. Obviously, their networks were disrupted overnight, and so we might have a slow recovery, but the bottom line is we will begin to have aircraft moving in and out of this airport at 11 o'clock.
Okay, so 1, 2, 3.
Has the flight recorder been recovered, the black box at all?
I don't think we can say anything about what's in TSB's purview.
You mentioned the airport opens 3 hours from now. There's a lot of helicopter traffic from the military, U.S. Park Police and all that. Will helicopters be flying right through here as well, beyond the recovery efforts?
I don't know the answer to that. Jack, do you have anything to add? We don't have anything to add about that. Yes.
For Secretary Duffy, can you reassure Americans that the U.S. still has the safest airspace in the world?
So the question is, can I guarantee the American flying public that the United States has the most safe and secure airspace in the world? And the answer to that is absolutely, yes, we do. We have early indicators of what happened here, and I will tell you with complete confidence, we have the safest airspace in the world.
What's next?
When it comes to informing these families who tragically lost their loved ones, what does that look like so far? Have any of them been informed? The flight manifest, is there any details you can provide on that front?
Can you add anything?
All I can say is that we have published the 1-800 number. We have family assistance centers set up here in DCA. We do in Wichita as well. I'm not at liberty to give the number of families that have been that have used those services, but we are making that use. We have over 100 team members that are either here or on their way that are specially trained to work with family members, handle travel arrangements, hotel arrangements, incidentals, to make sure that we're taking care of people in any way that they can, as you know, as our teams are hurting and suffering, as our passengers and their families need assistance. We're doing everything we can. I don't have any more information on that right now.
Mayor? Thank you. Next. Chief Donnelly, can I ask you to describe the next phase of the investigation? How confident are you that you'll be able to recover all 67 of these bodies? And can you speak to some of the debris that's also being pulled out of the river? We understand there are some suitcases, some other things that have been pulled out from the river. And I would like to ask anyone here, perhaps the Transportation Secretary or Mr. Eisen, if we know anything about these victims, age ranges, nationalities, anything of that nature.
So the next phase of this operation is going to be led by the NTSB. All of us are working together, though, to search the area and to find the victims. I'm confident that we will do that, and that will take us a little bit of time, though. It may involve some more equipment. As far as the things being collected, I don't have personal knowledge. I know that we have been collecting debris that you would expect to see from a plane.
Okay. Anything about the victims?
So the question is about the victims. The NTSB is going to lead that portion of the contact with the victims. I believe American is going to be involved with that as well, and so will the FAA and the Department of Transportation.
Secretary Duffy,
we're going to take some questions over here. 1, 2, 3, 4.
For Secretary Duffy, the flight path that the helicopter was on, is that a common flight path, and is it normal for helicopters to get clearance to cut across busy approach paths?
So I don't know if you all could hear the question. It's a question about the flight path of the helicopter. I don't want to go into too much detail about the information we have from the FAA, but obviously it is not standard to have aircraft collide. I want to be clear on that. But prior to the collision, the flight paths that were being flown from the military and from American, that was not unusual for what happens in the DC airspace. And as this investigation moves forward, we will be able to provide more information to you about the details of that statement.
I wanted to follow up on that question regarding the flight path, because you said it's standard. So can you speak to the conversations with air traffic control? Were there blind spots here? I don't know if you can stand.
So the question is, were there blind spots with air traffic control? I don't want to make statements about that. I don't lead into that answer. But again, I think whether it was air traffic control, whether it was military aircraft, helicopters, or the American flight, everything was standard in the lead up to the crash. Now, obviously, something happened here. You'll get more information and more details as this investigation moves forward. We'll learn what happened. But again, those who live in the D.C. area, we see military helicopters fly up and down the river. It's a standard path that they fly. They're used to aircraft landing at DCA, and there's a procedure in place because this happens every day. Something went wrong here. I look forward to the time and point when we can give you that information, but I don't want to comment on that right now.
Okay. Senator Keene, Senator Warner, you all have been, very vocal about your concerns about busy runways here, air traffic. I know it's still early in the investigation. I'm just curious, any steps that you all plan to take to address that?
We have raised this issue continuously. We've got very busy airspace. I think we will ask questions, but at the appropriate time. We are in this period right now where families are still being notified. We're trying to figure out what happened. There'll be time for those discussions, I think.
Yeah, I'd just say the same thing. We've been pretty plain about our concerns, but it isn't a good time to speculate right now. We have faith that the NTSB will provide the answers about this.
Okay, you fourth here, and I'm going to take 3 in the middle, and then we're going to have to wrap 1, 2, 3 after this young man.
Thank you, appreciate it. Chief, I know, again, I can imagine it must be traumatic for your first responders to have to deal with this. How are they doing right now, and are you all going to be offering any services to help them as they process this?
So thank you for the question. Our first responders are resilient people, but yes, this call will be hard for them. Our peer support teams are already engaged with the responders, and we'll be following up on that to make sure that they're okay. But I think the concern is real.
Okay.
Thank you, Ms. Mayor. What kind of communication was there between the helicopter and the tower, the plane and the tower, and the helicopter and the plane?
I don't want to say too much on the communication between the helicopter and the tower and the airline and the tower, but I will say this: there was communication. It was, I would say, standard communication. So there was not a breakdown, if that's your question, in communication between the military helicopter and the American Airlines flight. There was communication between the aircraft and the tower.
Was the plane aware there was a helicopter in the area?
I would say the helicopter was aware that there was a plane in the area.
President, so the president, you said yesterday that he called into the briefing room. Has he returned to the briefing room since then? Have you spoken? Also, a question about the National Security Advisor, Mike Waltz. He's saying that there was 30 bodies that have been recovered. That he just said that to the White House. Curious. I know you're in this presser right now, so that's hard for you to update. But I do have the question on CODIS in the briefing room.
I can do the body question first. So in terms of body recovery, as we recover bodies, we have a process, and we're not counting any bodies until they're in the possession of the medical director. So there may be some fluctuating in numbers that other people would report, but our numbers from the medical examiner.
So just in regard to the president in the briefing room, I've been with this team for the last hour plus as we've worked through the details of the information we wanted to give you. But it is my understanding that either this morning he was going to be in the Situation Room, or the Situation Room is obviously briefing the president. He has been kept in full appraisal of what is taking place.
Okay, last two, you and you ma'am. First.
You mentioned that the aircraft were on a standard flight pattern. Just curious, when the airport opens at 11 today, will planes be on that flight pattern again, or are they being directed to fly a different way to land?
Jack, do you want to? Okay.
Well, I mean, safety is paramount, and I don't have that information quite yet from the FAA, so I don't want to provide information I don't want to provide an answer or inaccurate information on what routes will be flown out of DCA.
Okay, last one.
Two questions really quickly. What do you know about the experience and history of the pilots of both the American Airlines plane and the Army Blackhawk helicopter? And then for Secretary Duffy, last night the president had said that this could have been prevented and questioned why air traffic control didn't tell a helicopter what to do. Is that something that investigators have determined should have happened in this situation?
I can quickly, Secretary. Just quickly, I don't have a lot of information to release, but these were experienced pilots. I know that the captain had 6 years with PSA, or almost 6 years with PSA, and the first officer almost 2 years. Again, standard approach, and that's about all I can say. Thank you.
In regard to the military, I don't have information in regard to the experience of the military pilots. I would just note that this was classified as a training mission. Sometimes people could think that a training mission is someone who is inexperienced in the cockpit. We call these missions that are flown in the D.C. area as our pilots are getting hours in experience training missions. So don't read into that we had how many hours the pilots on the military aircraft had. And you had another question for me that was...
Last night, the president had said that this could be prevented, and also that air traffic control, questioning why they may not have communicated with the helicopter, telling them what to do.
We are going to wait for all the information to come in from this vantage point, but to back up what the president said, what I've seen so far, do I think this was preventable? Absolutely.
Thank you.
20 or 30 assembled at Reagan National Airport with Mayor Bowser of Washington. We welcome all of you across the nation on a difficult day for American aviation and around the world. Good morning on YouTube. Thrilled that you could join us this morning. A somber Bloomberg surveillance. About 3 a.m., I said, get me somebody qualified. We're going to go to the guest here in a moment. It's not David Gura. We're going to go to a 40-year captain of American Airlines whose resume reads like Harrison Ford, except it wasn't Hollywood. It was Richard Levy doing the same thing. We're going to go to him in a moment. But first, on the politics of the moment, are David Gura as well. The one guy I wanted to hear from there, David Gura, was the senator from Kansas, Mr. Moran, who is on the subcommittee of aviation operations, safety, and security. For Jerry Moran, and with all the aviation heritage of Kansas, Clyde Cessna back to 1911, all they did in World War II, Airbus has operations in Kansas. This is a morning where aviation in America is forever changed, isn't it?
You're wise to bring him up, and he was one of the first people to respond to this disaster last night, the senior senator from Kansas who lives in Great Bend, Kansas, I think 110 miles away from Wichita. But he said last night in his comments, given how many people were on board this aircraft, given its route from Wichita to D.C., everyone's likely to know somebody on that plane. And so he asked for sympathy and really spoke to his fellow Kansans about the gravity of this moment. But you're right, Tom, he sits on the Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation. Right. This was a flight from Eisenhower Airport to Reagan Airport, so a lot of history and heritage there, as you point out.
In the emotion at DCA, they could not speak of anything but this heartbreak. But Senators Warner and Keene of Virginia alluded to the debate over our busy airports, plural, not just Reagan National. You studied this. The New York Times, Sydney Ember over at the New York Times has done great work on this. There's a lot of near misses, David Gura, aren't there right now? We are congested.
Yes, an extraordinary investigation by the Times, and I'm sure that you'll ask your next guest about it as well. But there were far too many of these near misses, and more than I think most people are aware of. And you did see those two senators from Virginia kind of declining to talk about the politics of the moment. I was struck by a phrase which I'll paraphrase here, which is, it's a time to investigate, not to speculate at this point in time. But the reporter who asked that question was wise to point out that it's something that they've brought up a lot of times, those two senators in particular, just the degree to which this airport is so closely situated to the nation's capital, and there is, as we've talked about, so much air traffic over this part of D.C.
Yeah, David, that's kind of what I'm coming to appreciate a little bit more with some of the reporting here this morning. We're here in the New York metropolitan area where we're used to just saying, hey, we're in some of the busiest airspace in the world. I didn't think of the Washington, D.C. area as much. And what's layered upon the commercial traffic is military traffic, which we don't necessarily have here as much in the New York metropolitan area. But that's something, and as you know, some of the speakers here at the news conference are saying, this happens every day in terms of we have commercial traffic and military traffic kind of working together every day. Something went wrong here.
You become used to seeing it, as they noted during that press conference, all of the aircraft above Washington, D.C. And I think something else stood out to me as well. You're bringing up the fact that you've got private aviation, commercial aviation, military aviation all across the Washington area. What you saw there at that news conference sort of encapsulates what's very unique about the area, the district, that you have all of these jurisdictions working together, and you saw each of them kind of paying deference and nodding to each other. But it really struck me as they ticked through how many first responders from how many different departments were participating in this formerly rescue, now recovery effort. And it really shows you just the way that law enforcement has to work together in this part of the country.
David Gura, thank you so much, and we'll hear much more from Mr. Gura. I believe we'll be briefing on this Washington tragedy on Bloomberg Television here in a bit, like in 50 minutes or so. In the middle 1960s, if you say, I want to fly, you fly. I don't know if you had a paper route or what. Richard Levy is a legend, folks. Multi-decades with American Airlines. I won't bore you with a resume other than to say he soloed on his 16th birthday. What was that like, Captain Levy? What was it like to be 16 years old and there's nobody helping you?
Well, let's say I was ready at 14, but Federal Aviation Regulations said I have to wait till my 16th birthday. So my instructor and I trained and trained and trained. I was ready a lot earlier, but we waited to the 16th birthday to comply with federal regulations. And then the newspaper was there in Houston. They covered me. It was very flattering, but it was fun to fly by myself.
You encapsulate the romance of aviation in America. It is shattered this morning. Not that you see this coming, but all of the talk, as was alluded to, Captain Levy, in the press conference, the near misses, our interior confidence in LAX or DFW or the others. Is it shattered this morning, our confidence in aviation?
No, I don't think so. Is this sad and regretful? Of course it is. For the families of the deceased on both sides. The PSA regional airplane, by the way, this was a PSA regional aircraft operated on behalf of American Airlines, but the flight crew were not part of the American Airlines pilots itself. Zero training from American Airlines. Yes, it had an American Airlines flight number. Every major airline in the U.S., not every, but majority have regional airlines feeding them in the smaller cities around the United States. That works very successfully. In any event, this midair collision here between the PSA aircraft, the CRJ 700 and the Army Black Hawk helicopter is very regretful, and we're going to learn from it. And I have some information to talk to you about that. But it is, as you know, very, very early. But some evidence is already starting to show up right now.
Captain Levy, how do you view the U.S. commercial airspace these days in terms of air traffic controllers, technology deployed? Is this airspace overcrowded? Is it well kind of managed, do you believe?
Very well managed, extremely well managed. I've flown the world, not every single airport, of course, but the majority of the major ones in Europe, Russia, China, of course, all over the United States and Asia. And the airports in the United States, whether it's JFK, whether it's DFW, you mentioned Chicago O'Hare, I was based there 35 years. Magnificently managed and run, but it's a two-way process there. You have the air traffic controllers on the radar as you approach or depart the airport, and then what we call the local controllers, the control tower people, and they're often working with good weather like it was last night at just before 9 p.m. Eastern time. It's a see and be seen. And so we can talk about that, but the PSA was brought into the airport normally, safely, correctly. We're going to be focusing on this Army helicopter, which we can talk about.
One of the changes here is, for example, Reagan going from 15 million passengers to 25 million passengers. In London, the talk of a congested one-runway Gatwick. I hear that Munich is terribly congested. I'm sure, Captain Richard Levy, you know many other airports just as congested. Are we pushing, in terms of not in my backyard, not building airports, are we pushing the envelope on crowded in modern commercial aviation?
In my opinion, not a bit. By the way, speaking of Munich, I made the first landing at the new Munich airport in the 90s from the United States. Great airport over there, great air traffic controllers, and all over Germany. But back to the U.S., to answer your question, we're not pressing the envelope, as we say in aviation, whatsoever, because as every one of us know, if we're approaching an airport and there's a big event, a football event, a baseball event, a rock star is there, there's going to be a lot of extra traffic. So what they do is one of two things. Either we go into a holding pattern, or to be more energy efficient, they hold you. There's a ground stop. You don't take off to go to the destination. Say weather has gone through Chicago. I told you I lived up there. A big snowstorm is covered the airport, is cleared out, the runways are clear. They're going to space the airplanes 10 to 20 miles apart. But back to last night, we have the PSA CRJ 700 on an approach to runway 01, and then they were asked, could they swing over, could they alter their approach and make a visual approach to runway 33. Nothing unsafe about that. Has nothing to do with traffic congestion whatsoever.
Captain Levy, when a military aircraft is in commercial space, it's the commercial air traffic controllers that have authority, right? That's not a military. I mean, they're treated like any other aircraft in the space, correct?
Correct.
So there you go. I mean, so there's going to be some issues there, Tom. I think.
One final question, Captain Levy, and you know, I remember the day when Ronald Reagan, I'm going to say this is an amateur, sir, broke the Union of Air Traffic Controllers. A lot of the reporting, including Sydney Ember and the Times, they have a grid out of the new workload of air traffic controllers. 10 years ago, I mean, you're a more ancient, Levy was a Kitty Hawk.
Yes.
Richard Levy, 10 years ago or 15 years ago, did you have more confidence that the air traffic controllers weren't fatigued?
No, I had no qualm or concern about the air traffic controllers. Yes, that was also my vintage in 1981. My neighbor in Chicago in the suburbs was an Air Force controller. I remember him, and he was brought from the Air Force to Chicago O'Hare, sharpest guy on the planet, and I had no qualm or concern. They did have extra spacing for between aircraft back then.
One final question, Captain. Can you bring back the 747?
I'd love to bring it back. May I comment? You all mentioned one comment, and then I'll let you go.
Please.
Technology. That's going to be an issue in this accident. That again, the PSA was asked, could you turn right and fly what we call a visual approach, very safe, to runway 33? They said yes. For that size of airplane, not a problem at all. Then you have the Army Black Hawk helicopter, which is on a training mission going to the Potomac River. Training mission does not mean they're amateurs whatsoever. There are pros, they're good as they come. You have an instructor pilot, most likely, I'm an Air Force type guy. And then you have somebody who is upgrading to whatever they call an Army aircraft commander, perhaps. In any event, so the PSA is descending, and we have equipment on the aircraft, on all commercial aircraft operating Part 121 of the Federal Aviation Regulations called TCAS, Traffic Collision Avoidance System. And it's an audio that says traffic, traffic, and as you get closer, it says climb, climb, or descend, descend. Well, why wouldn't that be going off? Because you're so close to the ground. So that is, it's blanking out as you get close to the ground.
We've talked to Robert Crandall over the years here at Bloomberg Surveillance, sir, and it's a great honor to speak to you today. Captain Richard Levy, 40 years with American Airlines. And now with our news in New York City, Michael Barr.
Tom, Lisa, it is now a recovery effort for bodies after a passenger jet with 64 on board collided with an Army helicopter while landing at Reagan Airport near Washington. D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser spoke at the news briefing just a few moments ago.
All Washingtonians, how very sad we are for American Airlines, for the United States Department of Defense, and for all Americans for the loss of life that happened with the collision of these aircrafts.
Bloomberg's John Tucker has more.
Michael, American Airlines Flight 5342 from Wichita, Kansas was inbound to Reagan National just before 9 p.m. Eastern when it collided with an Army Black Hawk helicopter. This witness describes what he saw.
We didn't think much of it. We thought they were like shooting stars. I don't know. I couldn't really explain it, but we didn't really think much of it until we saw the fire trucks start going out to the tarmac and the police cars and the police boats. It was insane. It was really insane.
The aircraft plummeted into the Potomac River. The jet was carrying 60 passengers and 4 crew members. 3 soldiers were on board the helicopter. D.C. Fire and Rescue Chief John Donnelly.
First units arrived on the scene and found an aircraft in the water and began rescue operations.
A few minutes before landing, air traffic controllers asked the arriving commercial jet if it could land on the shorter runway 33. Less than 30 seconds before the crash, controllers asked the helicopter if it had the arriving plane in sight. Seconds after that, the 2 aircraft collided. I'm John Tucker, Bloomberg Radio.
Thank you, John. So far, 27 bodies have been recovered. Global news 24 hours a day. And whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now, I'm Mike LaBarre. This is Bloomberg. Tom, Paul, Lisa.
Paul, you and I have said at EWR too many times, the pros tell us they have full confidence.
Yep.
I'm not sure I'm there.
Yeah,
I'm just not sure I'm there with the congestion I see.
Yeah, it's interesting. You know, you and I both Flight Radar 24, the app that we both kind of use just to kind of look at air traffic, and boy, it's busy out there. But
it's busy out there.
You know, you have to have faith, as I think we all do, in the air traffic system here. I certainly do.
And we'll see from the NTSB as well. We continue our coverage here. We say good morning to 99.1 FM in Boston and worldwide on YouTube.
Markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
And this Bloomberg Business Flash brought to you by Oracle. Attention growing businesses. Oracle is offering to cut your current cloud bill in half if you move to Oracle Cloud Infrastructure. For new U.S. customers with minimum financial commitment, offer ends March 31st. See if your company qualifies at oracle.com/Bloomberg. All right, well, we've got traders awaiting earnings from Apple later this afternoon. Also, economic news overseas. We have the ECB cut its key deposit rate by 25 basis points to 2.75%. And we have futures mixed. NASDAQ futures leading the gains. That's thanks to tech earnings. We have NASDAQ futures up 0.4%, 106 points. S&P futures up 0.2%, 15 points. Dow futures down 0.1%, or 73 points. The 2-year yield at 4.19%, down 2 basis points. The yield on the 10-year, 4.49%, and that's down about 4 basis points. And the Bloomberg Dollar Spot Index down about 0.1%. Want to get to earnings because we haven't been able to touch on a lot of it this morning. We'll start with Caterpillar because it's that bellwether for global economic growth. They had fourth quarter earnings that topped expectations, but here's the thing. It also warned that sales and revenues will be slightly lower in 2025 than last year, so its shares are down about 4%. And Tractor Supply Company is down 3%. It reported a miss on comparable sales for the fourth quarter. And finally, shares of Comcast lower, down 4%. It had gains for its movie studio and theme parks, but its streaming service, Peacock, missed estimates for subscribers. Peacock saw revenue increase of 28%, but it still reported a loss of $372 million. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News now. Wherever you get your podcasts, I'm Lisa Mateo. That is the Bloomberg Business Flash.
Lisa Mateo, thank you so much. Just say good morning to all of you across the nation. A troubled morning as we hear from the mayor of Washington, a press conference moments ago. The imagery here with the sun rising in Washington is most difficult. Paul, am I correct to say they believe no survivors?
That's kind of what that's what we've heard from the officials, Tom. So we'll stay on top of that. So
we'll stay on top of it through the morning. It's going to be a busy, busy morning. You have a testimony later in the morning as well?
Yes, we do. Tulsi Gabbard will be in front of the Senate committee.
Interesting to see. Right now, we thought we would take a lighter moment and study our economics as well. ECB cutting interest rates, euro weaker, because it's really important to understand that Paul booked this because February 1-ish, Saturday night, at the Cameron Harvey Indoor Stadium in Durham, row N,
yes.
2 seats. You ready? $2,400 each seat at the Cameron Harvey Indoor Basketball Court.
Exactly.
I'll tell you, $4,800. How much is the popcorn?
Exactly. Duke, Carolina, Saturday night at Cameron Indoor Stadium. The kids have been sleeping out Cheseskyville for, more than a month now, through the snow for these tickets. But there's some serious finance work going on at the Fuqua School of Business at Duke University, done by one Campbell Harvey, professor of finance. Professor, we had the ECB, as Tom was saying, cutting rates today, the Bank of Canada cutting rates, but we heard from the Fed yesterday that they don't seem to be in any hurry to cut rates here. What did you take away from the Fed meeting yesterday?
It was very confusing in terms of their statements. They're waiting for, quote, real progress on inflation. Well, we've had real progress on inflation over the last year and a half. So I have no idea what the plan is. It doesn't make any sense.
Paul just put the surveillance cork in my mouth. Continue, Professor.
Yeah, and this is, in my opinion, like a bad situation. So if you think about where we came from, an inverted yield curve to kind of a normal yield curve, we have had this normal yield curve evolve in a bad way. And what I mean by that is the long-term rate is going up. And that's very toxic for future economic growth. So think of all of the rates that are linked to the long-term rate. So when companies make decisions on capital investments, they're thinking of the long-term rate in terms of financing. When people are buying houses and getting mortgages, it's the long-term rate. So this is not a good situation for future growth. And I actually predict that in February, there'll be a Fed surprise. And what I mean by this is an extraordinary situation where the executive branch puts extreme pressure on the Fed to decrease the interest rates. We saw this a little bit during the campaign. We've had a lot of executive orders and things like that, a lot of chaos, but the chaos is just beginning when it comes to monetary policy.
What do you think Fed Chairman Powell will do in the face of potential pressure from the executive branch?
Well, I think that he will say that this is independent. We've been independent since the 1970s, at least, and we'll push back. But there's just so many levers that the executive branch can use to bring pressure to the Fed. And if you actually think about it, like who should be making the decisions here? Should it be just the Fed who's appointed, or should there be some input from people that are actually elected? And really what we're talking about here is growth. So we badly need economic growth. And I'm not impressed with the sort of comparison to, let's say, what's happening in Europe, where US growth is higher than European growth. That is a very weak benchmark to use. So we need to get on a higher growth path, and these rates being stuck so high for so long is not helping, right. It's hurting.
You've been persistent on this, Professor Harvey. I brought up yesterday, Ben Steele and Catherine Harding Elizabeth Harding, over at the Council on Foreign Relations, wrote a blistering essay yesterday, folks, in Barron's. I put it out on social yesterday. I'll get to it today as I can. Professor Harvey and even Richard Clarida yesterday on our show, we got a data-dependent ex-post shop, but they're also doing forward guidance. What's the value add of the dots? What's the value add of forward guidance?
Yeah, well, again, if you think about interest rates, it's really about the future. So it's the rate that you will get. And they're trying to effectively change expectations with this guidance. It turns out that the guidance is a very poor predictor of what actually happens. And the track record is quite poor for this guidance. I think we just focus too much on what the Fed is thinking, right, or the dot plot. Like, why not focus on the stuff that's important to energize our economy, to move from 2% growth to something substantial like 5%? No, we're focused on the dot plot, or what the Fed might say, or parsing the Fed's words.
Professor Harvey speaking the gospel of Tom Keene. I got a GDP redo, folks, from 2.6%. Buoyant, we come into a new guesstimate of fourth quarter GDP, 2.3%. But a real pop in personal consumption. This is a Sweeney factor. Sure. We went from 3.2 to 4.2%. And again, this is the wealth effect. And I mean, I think at Duke, they do teach the wealth effect.
They do.
There it is. 4.2% consumption is buoyant. Claims 207. Wow.
Wow. Cam, talk to us about kind of how you view tariffs. A lot of concern that this is just going to be kicking up inflation. Is that a concern for you?
So it's complicated. I gave a test to my students the other day. So there's a single question. So in terms of trade exposure, where does the U.S. rank in the world? So let's say it's 171 countries, and we'll measure trade exposure by exports plus imports divided by GDP. So I asked them, what is the rank? And the average was maybe like 20. And it turns out that the U.S. rank is 169 out of 171. So our trade sector is really small compared to other countries. So what this means is what happens with tariffs and stuff like that is going to have not like a major effect on economic growth. Right. So it will have some inflationary effect. Right. It is probably more bargaining, in my opinion, for better deals. But I think it's extremely unlikely that it goes through as was said in the campaign.
When you teach scarcity at Fuqua, do you teach $4,800 for 2 seats to Duke UNC basketball? I mean, are you running through the microeconomics of ticket pricing? What are they, 14 and 2 Duke or whatever?
Sure.
I mean, Professor, do you use that as a model?
It's a very small stadium, and I joined 1 year too late to Duke University because the year before, all faculty got the right of tickets, and
this is
no,
great.
I don't have that.
Our sincerest regrets. Cameron Harvey, thank you so much at Paul Sweeney's Duke University. Appreciate it this morning. Red and green on the screen. Futures up 18 here. NASDAQ up 0.6% as well. The VIX 15.85. Across the nation, and particularly for 99.1 FM, Washington, D.C., this is Bloomberg Surveillance. It is a good morning.
Markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
From the Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio, I'm Lisa Mateo. Well, we got futures right now mixed. This is after more economic data. We had fourth quarter GDP. The survey was for a rise of 2.6%, came in a bit lower, 2.3%. Personal consumption. Now, the expectation was for 3.2%, came in much higher, 4.2%. And finally, we had initial jobless claims. They came in lower than expected. 207,000 applications were filed last week. So the reaction still about the same on Wall Street right now. NASDAQ futures up about 0.4%, 93 points. S&P futures up 0.2%, 12 points. And Dow futures down about 0.1% or 77 points. We have the two-year yield at 4.21%. That's little changed. And the yield on the 10-year, 4.51%, and that's down 2 basis points. Other earnings out this morning. Shares of UPS, they're taking a hit, down 14%. Its outlook disappointed. A weak demand for its parcel shipments. Customers traded down from premium to economy shipping options. And we've been talking a lot about Meta, Tesla, Microsoft, but I also want to point out IBM, because their shares are up 10%. Strong revenue growth, also a jump in AI-related bookings as well. Now we get an update on that deadly collision in Washington, D.C. Let's go to Michael Barr for that.
Lisa, thank you very much. We are learning more about that deadly plane crash overnight near the nation's capital. An American Airlines regional jet collided with a military helicopter as it flew into Ronald Reagan Airport, and the worst possible outcome has been confirmed by officials. Bloomberg's John Tucker brings us the latest.
D.C. Fire and EMS Chief John Donnelly this morning delivered the grim but expected news on the crash.
We are now at a point where we are switching from a rescue operation to a recovery operation. At this point, we don't believe there are any survivors.
And after only a few days on the job, the U.S. Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy found himself surveying a deadly crash scene.
The fuselage of the American Airlines plane was inverted. It's been located in 3 different sections. It's in about waist-deep water.
While an investigation into the midair collision has only started, American Airlines CEO Robert Isom seems to indicate the military helicopter was in the wrong place at the wrong time.
And at this time, we don't know why the military aircraft came into the path of the PSA aircraft.
American Flight 5342 had come in from Wichita, Kansas, with 60 passengers and 4 crew members. It hit the Sikorsky H-60 Blackhawk helicopter with 3 military personnel on board while approaching the runway at Reagan National just before 9 p.m. Eastern. Footage of the deadly crash shared on social media showed the 2 aircraft colliding in the night sky and exploding into a fiery ball before falling into the Potomac River. I'm John Tucker, Bloomberg Radio.
Thank you, John. At least 28 bodies have been recovered. And the U.S. Figure Skating has confirmed that several of their members were on American Airlines Flight 5342. The athletes, coaches, and their families were returning home from the National Development Camp in Wichita, Kansas. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Michael Barr, and this is Bloomberg. Tom Paul Lisa.
Michael Barr, John Tucker, thank you so much for the coverage this morning. We continue to consider this horrific crash in Washington, but there's also economic, finance, investment news as well. The ECB cutting interest rates, as we saw Canada cut interest rates. Obviously, on a relative basis, that makes the U.S., which did not cut yesterday. Interesting, euro weakening, a 104.19 on euro. Bloomberg's surveillance this morning. We're brought to you by Cohn-Resnick Advisory Assurance Tax. Discover game-changing strategies to maximize value, optimize performance, and manage risk. Put your business at the forefront. Do that with Cohn-Resnick. We thank Cohn-Resnick for heritage support of all that we do. He was so interesting, particularly about the continent of Europe and this challenge of congestion, that we have decided to bring Sid Phillip back here. He drives so much of our airline coverage. We are fortunate not at Queen Victoria Street, but here at 731 Lexington this morning. I got all sorts of people, a 40-year veteran of American Airlines, various worthies at a press conference telling me it's a great system and all that. We will get through the tragedy, but it's a great system. I would suggest a lot of people don't believe that they're worried about, Paul, a near miss report here. a near-miss report there. You know, it's all been documented. I think David Gura mentioned the New York Times doing 2 extensive articles on this. Is it the same in Europe?
It's similar around the world. I mean, air traffic congestion is here to stay. I mean, every airline is trying to ramp up capacity. Everyone's trying to add more flights in.
Are we adding more airports?
That's really the billion-dollar question. And in the UK, they have talked about adding more capacity at London's Heathrow.
Well, the Chancellor of the Exchequer is getting pilloried right now, right? On a 3rd runway?
It is, she is. And I mean, and especially even with Gatwick, even with other airports. I mean, the problem is that everyone wants to add more air traffic capacity, but the problem is infrastructure takes a lot of time. So if you start building a new runway, it'll take years to be ready.
For you, with this international experience, does this tragedy change the debate in London, in Paris, worldwide, in Hong Kong?
It does. I mean, also it changes the debate about basically what practice is acceptable, how much risk is acceptable, and also, I mean, there was a discussion last year in the US particularly about air traffic controller hiring. There was a shortage of air traffic controllers post-pandemic, and the government talked about how they needed to hire more people on air traffic control.
Well, where is that? Is that still an issue in the U.S. and how does it relate to the rest of the world?
It is still an issue in the U.S. because I mean you can't just hire an air traffic controller off the street and then expect them to start directing traffic. I mean it takes years to actually train a controller, and so that's something that the U.S. government had as an ongoing process, and that's going to take years for them to actually come on board and actually be able to direct traffic. And that's similar to around the world, because around the world there's a massive shortage of air traffic controllers.
Well,
because post-pandemic, there's other jobs to be done in the aviation industry.
Sitting over at the Times has a great dot chart. It's actually a complex chart, Paul. I think on radio it doesn't work. But the answer is there's like 100% staffed. There's exactly 1 airport above the 100% line. Ready? Peoria.
There you go.
Good morning, Peoria, Illinois. According to this study by the FAA, Peoria is fully staffed, and you go down, and it's in terms of the big areas, Philadelphia is really ugly. New York is not much better, and then Miami's not much better than that. I mean, it's 82% are sub-staffed. I guess is the statistic.
And as Sid was mentioning, the pandemic was certainly played a role there. Sid, is there a role for technology to kind of bridge that gap, to just say, hey, maybe if technology improves, or as technology improves, that can offset maybe some of the other challenges we see in this system?
That has been sort of talked about in the past, but then, I mean, you have to have the lowest common denominator. So essentially, you have to make sure that all the aircraft, all of that can utilize that technology. It's no good having technology that's only on the latest generation aircraft if the previous generation and the older aircraft that are continuing to fly in the skies are also dependent on using that technology. I mean, essentially, you have to make sure it's backward compatible. And there has been talk about AI modernizing air traffic control, but there have been pitches about that for many years. I mean, at the end of the day, it's still a human being that makes sure that planes take off and land safely.
So when I'm going into Heathrow and I'm looking at my watch going, wow, we're 25 minutes early and we land an hour and a half late because I'm doing donuts up in the sky, I don't know, over Rotterdam. I'll let Sid decide. I mean, that's all the delay and the congestion, isn't it?
That is, I mean, and that's also down to the fact that there is limited infrastructure to handle all those planes. So essentially, air traffic controllers and runways and boarding the gates at the airport. So lots of things have to line up in order for you to be able to land 25 minutes early, Tom.
Sid Phillip, thank you so much. Greatly appreciated this morning. I got red and green on the screen, folks. Bloomberg surveillance this morning. A difficult morning, but we appreciate the support of IBKR. Interactive Brokers. Will U.S. oil production exceed 13.61 million barrels per day for November of last year, November of 2024? Trade your prediction with IBKR Forecast Trader. The yes vote was recently 35%. By yes or no, earn $1 if you're right. Go to ibkr.com/forecast. And we thank Interactive Brokers for support. as well. One of my favorite people joins us now after a Fed meeting, after an ECB meeting, still centered around labor. The claims number 207,000 is a boom economy statistic. Julia Pollack's going to tell me it's baloney. She's on the West Coast, and we're thrilled she could join us today. Julia, just give us an update here, and you have such a good wisdom at ZipRecruiter. Is it a fully employed America?
Well, I must say that every population that we serve at ZipRecruiter has become unexpectedly sort of bullish on 2025. Our employer survey anticipated an increase in the pace of hiring and strong wage growth. Our job seeker survey showed a big uptick in confidence. Our survey of new hires showed a surge in sort of strength and optimism. And so, the labor market ended 2024 with a surprising burst of strength. And that's likely, that's largely fueled by the consumer. It's holding up well.
A press conference begins in Frankfurt, Germany. Christine Lagarde speaking off of the ECB rate cut. Paul?
Julia, what's behind here, the strength of this market? A lot of folks are saying if you peel the onion back, it's the employers aren't letting employees go, but they're not hiring as well. How do you think about that dynamic?
So hiring has been unusually slow. This is a very low churn market, but overall net employment gains have sort of ticked up in the last 2 months of the year. The unemployment rate, which looked like it was heading north, has sort of come back down to a more healthy level. So this is still a strong labor market, and there are lots of tailwinds behind it. One is that workers have now received 2 years of positive real wage growth that's finally making them feel whole again after that huge surge in inflation in 2021 and 2022 knocked them off kilter. Earnings remain strong, companies are doing well, American consumers have access to an enormous amount of untapped housing capital, and home equity line of balances are going up as they finally are able to tap into that interest rates are a bit more reasonable.
Well, that line item, personal consumption, is that the wealth effect?
Yes, but employment is strong too. So this is right. The stock market has been doing well, delivering something of a wealth effect. Consumer confidence is holding up because we have avoided the much anticipated recession. So I think it's a combination of things.
Julia, how about the federal buyouts that we've heard from President Trump and his administration? Is that a material number of employees that you're even paying attention to?
Well, they're expecting about 5 to 10% of federal employees will take up these offers. That could be 150 to 300,000 workers. It's a pretty substantial number. That said, even if they all showed up as unemployed, which they won't, it would be just a fraction of a percentage point increase. So it won't have a big effect on the macro economy. It will have an effect on Washington, D.C. and Virginia and areas where there are large concentrations of federal workers in those particular industries, compliance, administration, regulation, et cetera. Yes, I think you will see an impact, an increase in the supply of talent there, and possibly a slight downtick in wages and bargaining power.
Julia, from your perspective, do you have any experience in with the federal government in terms of employment? Is it overstaffed? Is it bloated? Is it thinly staffed? How do we? I guess the consensus or the feeling is, or the assumption is, that it's bloated. Is that in fact the case from an employment perspective?
So the federal government operates differently from the private sector. There are these protections for federal workers that likely make firing much less likely than it perhaps should be. I think that's one of the reasons why, long before Trump's second administration, there was a backlash against remote work in the federal government. So initially in 2021, 2022, the Biden administration seemed very upbeat about the idea of remote work for federal workers, saying that they'd be able to poach talent. But then by mid-2023, there was a backlash in full swing. Senator Joni Ernst was calling them bubble bath bureaucrats. There were investigations. There were even charges of fraud being leveled against federal workers who took DC wages from the taxpayer but lived in lower cost places. And Biden himself, by September of 23, was calling for federal workers to come back to the office.
Oh, this is really important, Julia. Let's spend the last time that we have with you on this. I mean, work from home as we get away from the pandemic is a huge, huge debate. And I don't think we need to revisit the debate right now. But what does ZipRecruiter observe about work from home?
So remote shares of job postings on ZipRecruiter are flat as a pancake in just about every sector except government. So government is the one place where we saw the share go from over 10% in 2022 to 7.5% in 2023 to 5.5% in 2024. So a big backlash, a big pullback on remote work there before Trump even hit Washington, D.C. again, and before DOGE came in. And I think it's because the number one challenge that employers sort of cite, well, two challenges are culture and monitoring. Monitoring is the number one challenge. I think in the private sector where everyone is an at-will employee and you can just fire people, if you feel as though they're slacking off while working remotely, you just fire them. In the federal government, that's much harder. And so it is possible that remote work can be abused more in places where there's more stable employment, and firing is just not the done thing.
It's just brilliant. We got to talk more about this. What a raging debate across America. Julia Pollack, thank you so much. With ZipRecruiter, their labor economist, just fabulous.
You know what I noticed, Tom, when I was downtown for the remote broadcast at BAM, walking through the Oculus, which is the new post 9/11 transportation hub in Lower Manhattan, just spectacular. Yeah. It was the first time I remember walking through that, and it was really packed with commuters and workers.
You think it's congestion tax, maybe?
No, I think it's just people coming back to work in the office, and I think it's just more and more of that. Because the prior 2 or 3 times I'd walked through there, I was kind of taken aback by how empty it was, and boy, how the money that they spent to build that, and all the retailers that had taken up space, what a disappointment that was. Boy, I didn't feel like that this time.
Right, I agree, and I think Joe Weisenthal was out with an observation a few days ago saying, with the congestion tax in New York, he's seeing the subways busier than he's seen in quite a while. We say good morning to all of you. Paul and I need to do a data check here. Paul looked at me and said, Tom, gold, what's it mean? I don't know. Up $34 on gold, and we burst out to a new high. There's different ways to measure gold on the near future. $28. Move the decimal point, Tom. $2,827. $2,827 on gold, up $34. Commodities don't give me much love this morning. $76 on Brent, $72 West Texas Intermediate American oil. Paul was watching Bitcoin this morning with Matt Miller, 105,000 there. But, there's some interesting stories. Stocks move. Meta's up 2.8%. Microsoft goes the other way. Microsoft seemed like they hit on all cylinders, but the growthiness, and it was interesting, I guess they said in the call, the demand is there for AI, and they can't supply it because of the data center need.
That's the second quarter in a row they've talked about that. The Bloomberg News headline is Microsoft Cloud growth constrained by data center storage. Seems like an odd situation, but that's the second quarter in a row they've talked about that.
We are going to give you a touch of a tragedy of Wichita, Kansas. At 9 o'clock, we hope to go there. Their mayor, Lily Wool, will speak, and Jesse Romo, director of airports, at the Dwight David Eisenhower National Airport in Wichita. We want to cover that as we looked at Reagan National here earlier today. We thank Michael Barr and John Tucker for just yeoman's duty here, starting early in the morning on this horrific tragedy in Washington. A special thanks to Nathan Hager for his perspective and his leadership on Daybreak with Karen Moscow here this morning as well. Live at the Potomac, Anne-Marie Horton and Tyler Kendall covering this tragedy for Bloomberg News, but it's truly a global effort as well. Lagarde speaks in Frankfurt. If we get some headlines on that, we'll bring them to you. Right now, Euro actually a little better, maybe some enthusiasm from Christine Lagarde. 105 rounded up.
And your VIX,
Gold
Tom, your VIX is down below 16 here, Tom.
From 21
Yes.
in the Monday eggs.
Yep.
Monday seems what, a year ago?
Yes. Oh, boy.
A month ago?
In this news cycle.
We'll see. We'll continue our coverage. We go to Wichita, Kansas here in the morning. A tragedy at Reagan National Airport in Washington. Please stay with us. We're out on YouTube. Subscribe to Bloomberg Podcast. Do that worldwide in your Asia evening, at noon in the afternoon in continental Europe. This is Bloomberg Surveillance.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance with Tom Keene and Paul Sweeney.
I'm sorry, it's a boom economy, and that's what we're adjusting to.
Neither party seems to want to take on deficits at all.
With Lisa Mateo on markets.
Stocks are coming off another record high.
And Michael Barr with news.
Tensions between the U.S. and China have heated up even more.
The best in economics, finance, investment, and international relations. This is Bloomberg Surveillance on Bloomberg Radio.
Good morning, everyone. Paul Sweeney and Tom Keene. An exceptionally busy day, a tragic day for Washington. We continue our coverage of a horrific crash of a helicopter and a Bombardier regional jet. We've seen that in Washington. We'll continue our coverage. We're going to go to Tyler Kendall here in a moment at Reagan National. And then we are thrilled to bring in George Ferguson, scheduled to be with us from Bloomberg Intelligence with decades of the almost machinery of the aviation industry. We are scheduled to go to a press conference in Wichita. I've got an image of that in the studio. And also, much more coming up here simply on the markets. An incredibly busy day. Paul, it seems almost secondary. We have Apple earnings this afternoon.
Apple earnings after the close. We had some tech numbers. Tech companies last night report numbers, some mixed results and some mixed performance coming out of the tech industry. It's all eyes are on AI and the potential competition from China.
From the Interactive Broker Studios, our Bloomberg Business Flash, Lisa Mateo.
Yeah, we've got futures mix. This is after the latest two read on the economy. It didn't really change bets on the Fed's rate path. You had inflation-adjusted gross domestic product increase an annualized 2.3% in the fourth quarter after rising 3.1% in the prior period. So we'll start with S&P futures up 0.3%, 22 points. Dow futures down 0.1%, 44 points. We have NASDAQ futures up 0.6%, 148 points. So NASDAQ futures leading the gains, a lot of tech earnings. So we'll start there. We'll go to shares of Meta. They're up 2%. Mark Zuckerberg, he predicted its AI system will reach over 1 billion people in 2025. And Tesla shares up 4%, but Microsoft down 4%. That is your Bloomberg Business Flash. Paul and Tom.
Lisa, thank you so much. Sleepless in Washington, our Tyler Kendall joins us. She is at a forever changed Reagan National Airport. Tyler, after the press conference, now what?
Good morning, Tom. Well, there is a massive search mission underway here at DCA. Officials told us reporters at the briefing that this has moved from a search and rescue mission to a recovery mission. They are not expecting any survivors from this crash. The chief of DC Fire says that they have recovered 27 bodies so far from the Potomac River. We know that at least 64 people had been on board the commercial aircraft, but questions remain about what is going to go further here for the investigation. We know that the NTSB is expected to brief us reporters here later this afternoon. But Tom, this is the first time in more than 15 years that there has been such a serious crash of a commercial airliner, and we're waiting for updates here on the ground about what comes next.
I think more than anyone I know at Bloomberg, Tyler Kendall, you spend time in that terminal. I've seen her hold court at Legal Seafoods for hours. I'm sorry, Tyler, it's never going to be the same. How do you expect the congestion, the bustle, the vibrancy of Reagan National to change?
Well, Tom, people are actually already starting to come in here. Officials say that the airport will fully reopen at 11 a.m., but questions remain on how exactly that is going to happen. We saw the newly minted Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy, first day on the job, come out and say that this was preventable, trying to assure the American public that our airlines are safe to fly. But this city, as you know, and have been here many times before, this idea of the military aircraft and the airliner being in the same airspace, being on the same runway, is actually pretty common here in Washington, D.C. We're very close to the Pentagon, of course. So questions about how this happened, officials telling us that this actually was routine flight paths, but that the air traffic control was notified about this. So questions about how this crash actually came to be, we're still waiting on those answers.
Tyler, typically, I guess for the NTSB, what's the expectation and timing as to whether we'll get some real information about what happened? Is that measured in hours, days, weeks?
So we are expecting a briefing later this afternoon here at DCA. But what is interesting is that we did see the newly minted Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy come out and brief us. Normally that role is filled by the FAA administrator, but we know that right now there doesn't seem to be an FAA administrator. If you go to the website currently, that position is vacant because we know that on January 20th, the former administrator Michael Whitaker actually stepped down from his post with the new Trump administration. So we've been asking the White House about who is next to lead the agency as they continue this investigation. But we are expecting further details here. But you have to remember this search and now recovery mission is expected to take a little longer than originally planned. We were told by officials that the crash site is a little bigger than they originally expected. And last week, Washington, D.C. saw frigid temperatures. We had a freeze here in the region, and that is also complicating efforts considering the Potomac River is still frozen.
Tyler Kendall at Reagan, thank you so much. Greatly appreciated this morning. At Reagan National Airport as well. Paul and I need to do a data check. What are you watching in the Bloomberg Launchpad, Paul?
Yeah, a little bit of red and green on the screen here, Tom. S&P futures up about 20 points. That's a third of 1%. The Dow's off about 50 points, about 1/10 of 1%. But the Nasdaq seen some decent strength there, Tom, up 127 points. That's about 0.6 of 1% on the equity futures.
At 2 a.m., 3 a.m., we were piecing together the show, and it was a group resounding call of team surveillance. Can we get George Ferguson on? It's not just his knowledge of aviation, and we had Captain Richard Levy on, who's a pilot and incredibly experienced. George Ferguson is the one that pieces the industry together for us. George, where is the aviation industry in America in a year, in 2 years after this tragedy?
I mean, I think that the aviation industry has been, has been much safer than it had been in the past, right? And so I think that safety record continues. I mean, we're all saddened to see the event that just happened, the crash. Unfortunately, from time to time they happen, but it's much safer than it was decades ago. Right now, I think we're going through a phase in aviation, as we're going through in other industries, where there's a generational turnover in the labor in the business, and so there has to be a bunch of training. And I think, that training is critical to maintain safety. I'm worried that there may, maybe the Black Hawk pilot was in the midst of a training flight around a very busy airport and didn't, pay attention to all the cues from ATC. But again, I think the future of aviation is all about training. Strong training and building in that safety culture. And, I think we've got to pay, very high attention to it right now, given this generational change. But I think it continues to get better from here.
George, Paul and I were talking about this. I mean, there's a lot of reporting of near misses, beautiful graphics and fancy analysis because we've got all the technology. Are there more near misses now, or in the old days, did we just miss the near misses?
I've seen more reporting of near misses and other kinds of operations where airplanes are landing on taxiways and things like that. And again, I'm going to attribute it to there's a new generation coming in as we retire a bunch of baby boomers, people with less experience. There's been a lot of turnover in pilot ranks. ATC, we know they've been recruiting heavily because their ranks have been depleted. And so it's just critical here that we get these this next generation in, trained up, and focused on the right safety procedures. So, but I think there is more. I think there is more right now.
Hey, George, just give us a sense, from your conversations with the airlines that you cover, where is this country, where's our air system in terms of air traffic controllers? Where are we in terms of where we need to be? Do we have enough ATC folks out there, or where are we?
No, I mean, no, we know we have shortages, right? We know there's been challenges recruiting people into that business. I still hear the airlines talk about ATC issues limiting their operations. So we know we don't have enough, and we know we continue to need to recruit people into the industry. I think one of the challenges the industry has too, maybe it's lost some of its appeal over the years. People, young kids like tech a little bit more. So we got to go out and find more folks that love aviation and pull them into the industry, maybe work a little harder to get folk to recruit people into the industry, because maybe it isn't as exciting as it used to be, but that's a challenge.
And how do the commercial airliners, how do they typically feel about operating in areas where there's military aircraft? As we just saw today, I'm guessing that it just increases, just some of the tensions of operating.
It does, right? So, Reagan right downtown there in D.C., the convenience of that airport is huge. As anybody knows, it's flown into that. But, it's the nation's capital, so you're always going to have a fair amount of military activity around there, just trying to protect the nation's capital. And so,
yeah.
I mean, to have Blackhawks flying around the approach end of an airport, though, is extremely risky. I wonder if people don't revisit that. And to have a training flight around the approach end of Reagan at a busy time, busy evening is really difficult, right? So probably something we need to think about.
George, the critics here, and I'm not one of them, I don't think Paul is, I don't think we're qualified to be critics, will sometimes take our air traffic controller fatigue and staffing back to 1981, when President Reagan went after, I'm going to generally say the union. It was 13,000 people at the time. Do you buy it?
No, it's been a lot of years since then, so I think we've probably fully recovered since Reagan let go all the controllers.
Where do we typically get controllers? Where do they recruit them from? And why is it so difficult? Starbucks, yeah. Why is it so difficult? It seems like, I don't know, the pay is there. It's kind of exciting. I know it's stressful. But where do they typically get recruits?
So, I guess people who love aviation and don't want to be a pilot, maybe want to sleep in their own bed every night, become a controller. But you can imagine it's a really difficult job, right? You've got a lot of lives on your hands. Again, if you're controlling at an airport like Reagan, Newark, LaGuardia, there's a lot of things going on. So you better be top of your game. Yeah. Look, during the pandemic, remember we were all sort of, those of us in business, in the office world, we weren't even going to the offices anymore, right? We were waking up at 6:30, turning our computer on at 7. You don't get that in the air traffic control business. You get a chance to do some late night shifts, and you're tired, and you're trying to bring airplanes in for a landing and keep everybody separated. I think it's a challenging job, right? And that's one of the reasons why it may not appeal to everybody.
George, you're expert on this. I guess DFW is the size of Luxembourg, and you mentioned, Paul, earlier, Denver. We went from Stapleton out to the beautiful airport in Denver. Salt Lake City building a palace, Kansas City building a palace. Do we need more airports? Do we need more gates, George Ferguson?
Well, look, I'm going to say that the challenge is that, some of those key airports in the country you can't replace well, right? LaGuardia, Reagan, because of their downtown proximity, even if you have more airports, there's capacity at Dulles to put airplanes into. But nobody wants to take the trip in from Dulles to DC. So I don't think this is we don't have enough airport issue. Again, I think it's a Blackhawk training flight around an extremely busy airport. ATC, it sounds like they moved the landing
flight
runway
to 33, the shorter runway, up to the north, closer to the White House.
And so if you're that Blackhawk pilot and you weren't paying attention and ATC said, hey, Blackhawk, you got this CRJ,
Right.
You miss on that, and you weren't expecting that airplane to come into that other runway, bad things happen. So I don't think this is an airport issue. I think this is training, paying attention. The Black Hawk apparently just didn't see what was going on.
George, thank you. We look for your publication at Bloomberg Intelligence as well. Just great conversations today on this tragedy there with a guy with decades of experience in aviation. You and I just sort of wander through the airports,
oblivious, just get to our
we've
gate.
got, major stress, like, how long is the line in TSA and all that. These guys are really doing it.
Yeah, you see some of the footage of air traffic controllers, and we all saw it back in the 80s when we had that issue with the union, but I think we've all seen it in movies and TV shows. It's just extraordinarily stressful job. I just don't know where you find those people.
The mayor of Wichita is speaking now, taking questions. Lily Wu in Wichita. We're not going to take that right now. We just got such a loaded schedule here as well. Trying to get to the market opening in 15 minutes with futures up. Russell leads the way. NASDAQ up 0.6%. The Dow lags fractionally as well. As Paul mentioned earlier, the VIX under 16. I guess it's a bull market, 15.91, but I guess I don't feel it.
And we had some economic data out here earlier today, Tom. GDP annualized for the fourth quarter came in a little lighter than expected, 2.3%. The consensus, the survey was 2.6%. Remember, the prior period is 3.1%, so a little light there on economic activity. Personal consumption, though, Tom, consumers are still out there spending. Came in a growth of 4.2% for the fourth quarter. The consensus was 3.2%. And then on the jobs front, Tom, initial jobs claims, another, I think, pretty strong print there for the labor market. 207,000 on initial jobless claims. The consensus was 225, so better than expected.
Bob emails in. The Bruins are so weak this year. He's not third. He's like fourth string goalie for the Bruins. But he's outside Boston. Good morning, 92.9. Bob emails in with a nice analysis. And he goes to one of my favorite numbers, which is real final sales to domestic purchases. I'm going to call it domestic final sales. And to the wealth effect, it's a solid number, 3.1%.
Yep.
And I don't think we're quantifying, like, the wealth effect at the Mateo household is just extraordinary right now. Lisa, how's that wealth effect going at Costco? You spending it in the egg section, if
Most
there are any?
definitely in the egg section. Yeah, we got to make a trip this weekend.
And there'll be
we'll
no eggs. I mean, the whole thing at my house is there's just no eggs.
There wasn't at the supermarket, but at Costco, they will have them.
They will come through for you.
Yes, thank you.
That's good to know. Futures up 16. The VIX again under 16. A little too much math there. 15.96. On a somber morning with our news in New York City, Michael Buck.
Thank you very much, Tom, Paul, Lisa. Rescue teams have recovered 28 bodies of victims from the Potomac River after the mid-air collision of an Army Black Hawk helicopter and a passenger jet near Reagan National Airport in Washington, D.C. The FAA says an American Airlines regional flight 5342 from Wichita, Kansas was on approach for landing when it collided with the helicopter on a training flight last night. This morning, D.C. Fire and Rescue Chief John Donnelly said they are switching from a rescue to a recovery operation. This morning, newly confirmed Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy said the flying public can feel safe. The crash occurred on approach to the runway with the jet carrying 60 passengers and 4 crew and the helicopter carrying 3 military personnel. Tulsi Gabbard says she is no one's puppet and she is promising to end the weaponization of intelligence as she gets set for confirmation hearings to be President Trump's Director of National Intelligence. Bloomberg's David Gura has more on what to watch from today's hearing. Bloomberg's David Gura will bring you live coverage of Tulsi Gabbard's confirmation hearing before the Senate Intelligence Committee at 10 a.m. Wall Street time. Listen on Bloomberg Radio or watch on the Bloomberg Podcast YouTube page. Also today, there are confirmation hearings for Kash Patel, Trump's nominee for FBI director. And it's day 2 of congressional hearings for the nominee to be the Health and Human Services Secretary, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with the Bloomberg News Now. I'm Michael Barr, and this is Bloomberg. Tom, Paul, Lisa.
Michael Barr, thanks so much. Christine Lagarde speaking at the ECB, some pointed questions to say the least. Paul, I don't know what to make of this. Confident Bitcoins won't enter reserves in the EU.
Okay.
Sounds like a different tune than in America.
In America, because we're talking about that in the U.S. here. So.
Wages are on their way down, and it will impact services, says Lagarde. Lagarde says good reason to believe consumption will pick up. That will be because of American tourists doing too much in Paris. I'm kidding. A little editorialization this morning. The euro right now is at 104.31, up ever so slightly out to 4 digits off of Christine Lagarde's discussion. The right person at the right time. Francis Donald, RBC Capital Markets, joins our chief economist. Francis, I saw buoyant consumption, which tells me there's something that gave way. What was the weak statistic in the GDP algebra?
Oh, well, excuse me, we got a little decline in business investment. We got a little bit of a stagnation in trade activity, but nothing is a narrative change for the United States. And that's what I'm looking for when I look at data that comes through. Is there's anything that's giving us a yellow flag? And right now, no real yellow flags. The consumer on aggregate, emphasis on aggregate, is very strong. And I was told very early in my career 20 years ago, never bet against the U.S. consumer. That advice is still true.
Okay, I get it. Yesterday, the Fed level, but Canada cut rates. ECB cuts rates of some flavor as well. Is the gap widening between America's prosperity and other nations struggling?
It's a very wide gap. One of the best ways that you can think about that is all these central bankers are talking about their neutral rate. What is the rate that is neither tightening nor easing on the economy? And nobody else, except for the U.S. Federal Reserve, is claiming that their neutral rate is much higher than it was before COVID. Canada, ECB, all effectively saying their neutral rate is probably around 2.5%. And now we have a Fed that says we think that rates are above the neutral rate, but 4% seems okay to us. That is a huge, huge change in the way that global monetary policy operated. And I think it's being driven by massive amounts of U.S. fiscal spending that's put a complete floor under growth and is creating this offset between fiscal and monetary. So as much as there was focus on the Fed yesterday, and we always have to write our Fed write-ups, I spent more time thinking about government funding freezes and what the path of fiscal is going to look like ahead. Because my sense is it's the fiscal path ahead that's going to be more important for the Fed than maybe even the unemployment rate or the CPI.
Francis, as the chief economist for the Royal Bank of Canada, I am sure you and your colleagues have thought long and hard about tariffs and what they may mean for the economy in North America, particularly Canada, the U.S., and Mexico. How are you thinking about those? Because guess what? February 1st is 2 days away.
It is. And one of the challenges is that just about everybody wants us to give a nice round number. What does this tariff policy mean for GDP or growth? But it's an extraordinarily difficult economic exercise. We still engage in it, but it's really hard. And we've actually developed infographics to try to explain just how convoluted this is. Even before a tariff lands on an economy, you tend to see things like uncertainty shocks weigh on business investment, inventory hoarding. So we were even noticing in the GDP data this morning that consumers had this big spend increase on durable goods in the United States. And we were talking amongst ourselves, is that consumers that are maybe thinking about autos and washing machines starting to become more expensive? So even before the tariff lands, you tend to see inventory hoarding that changes your data. You got to talk about whether there's going to be retaliation. You got to talk about what secondary industries are being impacted. And then maybe some of the biggest assumptions you have to make, and this is what keeps me up at night, how are central bankers going to respond? Because while we have a good playbook, Tom, we've been talking for years, we know if inflation goes up, central banks hike.
Right.
But what if inflation going up is a function of tariffs rising and interest rates are not going to impact that type of inflation? That's the biggest question that we have.
Okay, this is really important. And Carl Weinberg and Mary Chen just publishing High Frequency Economics with the idea that it was, within the mix and the soup of it, a disappointing report. Was there a tariff reaction in that second look at GDP, or does that await, let me do the math, April 30th or, May 1st report?
My sense is we'll see more of that, but what I'm really looking for is the inventories component. Now, this is not something that seems very dramatic most of the time, but if we do see a lot of Americans who start thinking about, hey, prices could go up, you could actually see growth accelerate on the surface because you're going to see an acceleration in trade moving forward. So we did see that. We know a little bit more about tariffs now than we did in 2018, and inventory hoarding is a real economic development that could occur within a tariff landscape. And let me just say this, it doesn't even matter if the tariff itself is implemented. We see this behavior ahead of the tariff coming through. So even all this talk, all the tweets, et cetera, of tariffs will have an economic impact. We know that to be the case.
Francis, I think we here in America, we import some stuff from Canada, from Mexico. What's the feeling up there in Canada today about what kind of, response the Canadian government may have if tariffs are in fact placed?
Well, I'll share with you that in Canada, our Canadian clients view tariffs as a high probability, high impact event, and they are very likely, if they're applied in extreme, to create a recession in Canada, and different variations, of course, would not produce it. We're still waiting on those details. In the U.S., my clients are a little less concerned about either the probability or the impact that comes through. But just a reminder, Americans import a ton of stuff from Canada, significant amounts of electricity, a quarter of all the oil consumed comes from Canada, everything from nickel, 40% of the nickel in the U.S. economy. There's a significant amount of imports that come through from Canada that will raise prices for Americans, and how the currency responds is going to be a big impact from that. But most government officials in Canada, this is just public knowledge, it's not me opining, have talked about retaliation. So we know the balance of risks. We might not know the magnitude for Americans, but we know the balance of risks is going to be higher prices and lower growth. And just the details of that is going to matter extraordinarily. And it's not me trying to say we haven't done the work, we have, but there are so many steps to modeling a tariff impact that it can't be summarized in one specific word, which is why the Federal Reserve is not implementing it. And it's why places like the Bank of Canada are speaking to the risks, but not putting a dollar figure on it just yet.
Francis, David Gura just spoke to Chrystia Freeland. As you know, there's a derby up in Canada for the next leader after Mr. Trudeau. I know it's inappropriate for you to pick sides on this, but help our American audience. What's the timeline to the election right now into the spring?
Oh, we don't know. We know there'll be a new leader of the Liberal policy. And I am an economist, not a political scientist. But from what I read in the papers, that means that the new leader of that policy will become prime minister, and then likely an election will be called. So if you think about uncertainty for the Canadian economy, or even uncertainty for American businesses that are trying to figure out will there be retaliatory measures, it's been really challenging to hear one particular cohesive voice, because at this time we're really relying on provincial leaders, for example, to give us a sense of what's ahead. Now, Tom, you've got me totally outside the scope of my credentials here. What I can tell you is people are talking a lot about the uncertainty of tariffs, but uncertainty shocks are powerful economic taxes. And whether you're in Canada or the US right now, you're experiencing different variations of uncertainty taxes. So some of our data, which is backward looking, is not going to show it, but you should expect this to show up in places like business surveys, manufacturing activity, consumer sentiment to a certain perspective. I really would not downplay how important an uncertainty tax or uncertainty shock can be on an economy, and all the places and the tentacles for which that'll flow through all of North America.
This has been wonderful. Thank you for the brief. Francis Donald with the Royal Bank of Canada, RBC. Appreciate that this morning. Futures advance up 24. It's a sprightly lift to the market. Microsoft, we're 1 minute away here. And Paul, we barely talked about it with all the news flow, particularly from this horror in Washington. I got a 442 close, and I'm enjoying an opening here in 45 seconds in the vicinity of 418.
Yeah, that would be
that's south.
That's south, about 5.5% here. And again, the headline reads Microsoft cloud growth, which again has been kind of the driver of this name and a lot of big tech names, constrained by data center shortage. So there you go.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost a capacity issue as well. Again, futures up 21, the VIX 15.97. Apple Computer this afternoon. We'll have full coverage of that. Of course, a very busy morning here. Perhaps a press conference coming up. Right now, a press conference on the market opening with Lisa Mateo.
And we've got your opening bell report sponsored by IBKR. Will the U.S. CPI exceed 2.8% in January 2025? You can trade your prediction with IBKR Forecast Trader. The yes recently up 35%. Buy yes or no and earn $1 if you're right. Go to ibkr.com/forecast. We are off and running. We'll start with the S&P 500. Right now up about 0.3%, 23.6061. We have the Dow. Little change, down about 4 points, 44,708. And the NASDAQ up 0.2%, 58 points at 19,689. The 2-year yield at 4.21%. That's little changed. And the yield on the 10-year, 4.52%. And that is little changed as well. I have to go to commodities. We have COMEX gold, $2,828 an ounce. When we look to Brent crude, $76 a barrel, up about 0.3%. WTI crude, $72 a barrel. The Bloomberg dollar spot index, that is down about 0.2%. Want to point out the euro, though, up about 0.1% at 104.33. And that's after the ECB cut interest rates by 25 basis points to 2.75%. At the open, have to check in with Meta up 2%, Tesla up 5%, IBM up 9%, but we have Microsoft down 5%, Apple, which reports after the close, they're down just a fraction. That is your Bloomberg opening bell report. Paul and Tom.
Lisa, thank you so much. Greatly appreciate it. Paul Sweeney and Tom Keene on a difficult morning. We may be going to Washington here in a bit. We're trying to line up the ducks right now. On that, and this is a guy. This guy came in a while back, and we were just blown away with his housing, and the perspective on rental and home ownership with Middleburg Communities. Brad Case joins us now, Middleburg Communities chief economist. But I would be remiss if I did not address the shock of Vienna, Virginia, over this plane crash this morning. I mean, the distinction of Dulles into Washington and Reagan is something you live with each and every day, isn't it?
Yeah, we live right halfway between those two airports. I don't know. I haven't heard anything yet about where the people who appear to have died lived.
Right.
But it's
yet
entirely
to be
possible.
Reported.
Yeah, they may be neighbors.
Our thoughts to you and all of Middleburg Communities. Very, very difficult to say the least. I got a line. I don't know, Paul, where it is. It was something in Lincoln Douglas debates. But there's a line north-south in America, and to the west of that line, rentals are weak. But I guess to the east of that line, maybe rentals are not weak. Are we a bifurcated America in terms of our rental properties?
No, I wouldn't say that. There is a continuing migration from some cities to other parts of the country, especially, the Sun Belt. There is a continuing people moving there. It's been happening for decades, partly because of the weather differences, and then it certainly got a boost because of COVID. So you have markets in the Sun Belt with much more supply growth, but also much more demand growth. So and then you have markets sort of in the northern parts of the country, especially the Northeast, where you just don't have the demand growth. You don't have the supply growth that you've seen in the Sun Belt. So it's not that most markets are in terrible imbalance, but there is some imbalance right now in certain places like Austin or Nashville. That's gonna evaporate pretty quickly because of the demand growth.
So, in the residential real estate business, interest rates are important.
Absolutely.
It looks like the Fed is, they started cutting. Looks like they're in that pause mode for a while. Maybe we'll get one, maybe we'll get 2 rate cuts this year. How do you guys in your business think about that?
So we want to be able to do our business in any interest rate situation. Lots of people are in the development business when interest rates are extraordinarily low. We can't afford to do that. We have to be able to deal with it even when interest rates are high. I think that the Federal Reserve should not have cut as deeply as they did last year. Inflation pressures are still too high, and they're certainly higher now than they were a couple of weeks ago. And that keeps longer-term interest rates up, which means borrowing costs for us.
I would think in your business, developing residential real estate communities, you depend upon labor. That's
Absolutely.
a big part of your cost structure.
Yeah.
And I would think a lot of that labor, as I understand it, comes from migrant labor, legal and illegal. I think about agriculture, I think about construction, two of the industries that are really impacted by immigration policies. How are you guys viewing that at this point?
Well, you're absolutely right. Agriculture and construction are the big two. So we are a general contractor. We hire subcontractors, and we know overall statistics about employment in construction. I don't know about the people who work on our projects. Even if none of the people working on our projects is here illegally, or I should say without documentation. Certainly, to the extent that other construction workers are being removed from this country, it makes it more expensive for us to hire labor for our projects. So you've got a situation where interest rates are high and likely to stay high, and at the same time, labor costs are likely to go up fairly sharply. So that's a big problem for residential construction generally.
Brad Case with us with Middleburg Communities. We'd like to speak to him just about the granularity of multifamily and actually single family as well. So I looked up Juniper Row in scenic Elkhorn, Nebraska. Good morning, Elkhorn, Nebraska. I'll figure out from Cozad. Cozad is where you filled up your car.
Really?
You got to Omaha.
Oh boy.
And Boulder was out there.
Exactly.
So you'd strategically try to figure out where to fill up the car.
Okay.
Cozad, Nebraska.
Cozad, Nebraska.
Good morning, Elkhorn, Nebraska, Juniper Row. Are you competing out there with fancy private equity, private credit people in New York City buying thousands and thousands of homes?
No, we're in a different business. So
Why? That looks just like what they're buying. How are you in a different business?
we are developing communities, whether it's a multifamily community or a single-family rental housing community. A lot of the companies that have gotten press for buying up houses, they're buying up scattered site housing. That's not our business. When people want to rent a single-family house in a community, they are renting amenities that come with that. The pool, the gym, all of the other amenities that you would get in a multifamily community, a well-built, modern multifamily community. They're getting them even though they've got 4 walls and a yard. So that is the business that we're in. We're not really competing against the scattered site. And I don't think scattered site is a continuing business model. It's just too costly to keep maintaining houses all over the place with different appliances and different things that need to be repaired.
I got to admit, I wonder about that.
Oh yeah, no, you can make a run at it. It's just not a very lucrative business because of the cost. It's much better to build something that you can maintain more easily and with less costs. And then you pass that along to the renters, and that means that they're getting a good product and not paying as much as they would if they had to pay indirectly for all that specialized repair.
Explain to people like us, benumbed by tri-state Bloomberg 1130 rental and ownership costs. Yep. In Elkhorn, Nebraska, the rent's under $2,000 a month.
Yeah.
Nice.
What is that like?
Look, and there are a lot of places where it's a lot less than that.
Really?
Oh yeah. No, there are places where you can get a perfectly good apartment for $1,200, $1,300 a month. The difference is they've got the housing stock that was probably built a long time ago. Most of it was built a long time ago, and people aren't moving in. Even in Nebraska, yeah, they're moving into a place like Omaha, or in Iowa, they're moving into a place like Des Moines, but they're also moving out to a place like Charlotte. So in a place like Charlotte, that's where the builders are simply trying to keep up with the number of people who are moving into the market. And the other thing that's going on is people are deciding between buying a house and renting. Even if they want to rent 4 walls and a room, generally and a lawn, generally speaking, right, they get wealthier by renting than by buying.
Let's stop the show. We're just I don't want to talk to anybody else but Brad Case right now. Is the home ownership mathematics destroyed in America?
Yeah, it never has been a very good trade-off in terms of expectations. Some people get lucky. You buy a house, it turns out to be a great time or a great place to buy a house. But in terms of, can you expect to build wealth? Well, the better way to build wealth is to put money in the stock market. And if you buy a house, you have to take 20% of the value of that house out of the stock market and put it into an asset that doesn't appreciate.
Can you come over to dinner and explain this to my family?
I would love it.
Okay, Brad Case, thank you. So what do you think of that, Paul?
It is, I know. Or you get lucky, as Brad was saying, and you sell your real estate in the midst of a pandemic. And once in a 100-year pandemic, you're a net seller.
My parents sold their house at the top of the market, given this a million years ago. But you get lucky.
Yeah, but that's it. I agree.
But that's true stocks, too.
When I'm buying houses, I feel like this isn't an investment. It's a place to live. If I make a little money, great.
I run the HP-12C on it. I'm amazed, like in the Wall Street Journal, the mansion section.
Yep. Oh, I love that.
And, you look at it and it's like, OMG, boom, 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 and it's like 3% nominal return before expense. I mean, that's what it ends up. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Don't be a stranger. It's a pleasure. And again, our sympathies to all of Vienna, Virginia, after just a really difficult day there. Brad Case is with Middleburg between Dulles and a somber Reagan airport today. SPX up 78 points, NASDAQ up 0.6% as well. I thought we'd get let me do this. We're going to go to Lisa right now. It's from the Interactive Broker Studios. We do need a business and an earnings flash. Lisa Mateo.
We do, yeah. And like you say, Tom, we've got green on the screen after the latest read on the U.S. economy ended in 2024 with solid but softer growth. And also the latest jobless claims data showed signs of a solid labor market. So we'll start with the S&P 500 up 0.4%. That's leading the charge, 27 points. The Dow up about 0.1%, 62 points. And the NASDAQ up 0.3% or 70 points. The 2-year yield at 4.21%, little change. The yield on the 10-year 4.52%, and that's up down 1 basis point. The Bloomberg Dollar Spot Index down 0.2%, and we have Bitcoin on the rise up more than 1% at just above 105,000. To earnings, have to point out UPS down 14%. Wow. Shares experienced the biggest one-day drop since 2008. The reason why its outlook disappointed, weak demand for its parcel shipments. Then we go to Southwest Airlines. Their shares up nearly 2%. Quarterly profit higher than analysts expected. Strong holiday leisure travel, also higher ticket prices. And shares of Cigna taking a hit, down 8%. Profit missed estimates, higher medical costs. And finally, MasterCard, they're up about 4%. Reported earnings topped estimates at broadening it out its services. After the bell, we move on to Visa. We can't forget Apple, Intel, and also U.S. Steel. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash. Paul and Tom.
Lisa, thank you so much. Again, green on the screen. The VIX does a Paul Sweeney bull market, 15.68. Part of the joy of working here are people that have worked here for longer than 2.5 years. John Tucker was given the assignment of collating, bringing together all of the different information of this crash, which now seems doable, but trust me, at 3 a.m. was a leap of faith. And he does that with experience, including in 2001, a very difficult plane crash at JFK. John, you've seen all sorts of plane crashes. How does this one fit in to the too many others you've reported
Well,
on?
it's always the investigation starts, it's in the early phase, and everybody has got a reason for the crash. And it's just like, in the end,
And the mayor of Washington was real clear, let's wait for NTSB.
You wait, and I don't even think the President of the United States was waiting in his tweets. But anyway, the CEO of American, you heard him at that news conference this morning indicating, at least to me, it sounded like he was blaming at least the helicopter or maybe controllers. He said the American Airlines flight was headed into the Reagan National runway 33, and everything was normal. They were at the normal altitude, the normal speed. They were following the controller's direction when they ran into the Black Hawk military helicopter. Now, anybody who goes in and out of Reagan National knows that is the Potomac. It's right on the shores, and there are military aircraft going up and down the Potomac constantly through that area. You see the aircraft on final approach to that runway heading right over the bridge at, just several hundred feet off the ground over the Potomac on the final approach. So it's just like, I've had the thought more than once, my God, how can this not happen more often? And it's an airport that has been around, I think, in 1940, and even before it was established in the early 40s, right. There had been a strip there going back to the Wright brothers.
Well, and Paul, there was a brilliant chart. I do not have it in front of me, folks. I don't want to speak out of turn. But Paul, there was a chart that showed each individual runway at our major airports, and the main, not the 33 runway where this plane was attempting to land, but the main runway, which we've all been on at DCA a million times, is the single busiest runway in America.
Wow.
It's like at Gatwick in London. Yep. There's no other choice.
And just from the perspective of being in the co-pilot seat coming in there in a smaller aircraft, the controller at the time speeded up. You've got a jet on your tail and saying to the old man, hey, we got to lift up the landing gear because we can't land with the landing gear down at 120 knots. And you had to put it down right at the last second. And that was a sweaty moment, I got to tell you.
Yep. Just some reporting coming out of Bloomberg News. The Skating Club of Boston says 6 members or associates were killed when an aircraft went down in Washington, including 2 teenagers. So we're getting some of that reporting coming in as well.
That difficult reporting that we will see. And, of course, the Skating Club of Boston has an incredible heritage. I can't even begin to describe the heritage there. I was so fortunate within Western New York of Ritter Shumway, and these are people that made the Olympic moment happen for America way back. And I would suggest in New York and in Boston was the foundation of what we all saw with, as far back as we go, Peggy Fleming and on to where we are in the modern day. We'll unfortunately get much more of that reporting today. John, what do you see for the rest of the morning out of a fractured Washington?
Well, now I'm starting to hear all these politicians weighing in, newly installed. I don't even think we have a new FAA commissioner installed at this point.
You're on the short list, John.
Well, not an easy job. And I have to distinguish between the FAA and the NTSB, the National Transportation Safety Board. The experts, the pilots, everybody who follows the industry knows that that's where the real expertise lies with the National Transportation Safety Board, and usually the FAA kind of associated with more of a political realm. So let's hope in this new administration that remains to be the case, where that's where we keep the professionals, where the professionals aren't guided by any influence by politicians or whatever, and investigate what they have to investigate and say what is the truth and what has to be said in the final.
Paul, I believe we just saw, and I don't know if it was taped or live, but the 29th Secretary of Defense of the United States, Pete Hegseth, was just on Fox, and maybe we'll hear from him.
He was commenting earlier at the Pentagon about the Black Hawk helicopter and the crew members on board. It was basically one of the yearly inspections that they have to do of each other in the flight mode in the helicopter.
Yeah, they do
proficiency
that
tests that they do.
John Tucker, thank you so much. Greatly appreciate it this morning. Exhausting day for Mr. Tucker. Usually, he's in 6-7 hours. Is about.
That's a long day for him.
It's a long day.
We're keeping him a little bit longer.
He went out to 8 hours today.
Exactly.
We're kidding. John Tucker driving the ship here and early in the morning as well. The market lifts. It's not due to Big Brown.
No, boy.
And UPS.
Yeah.
Wow.
I mean, down 15%. All I know is the boxes pile up on my door every day. I mean, they're coming from everywhere. FedEx, UPS, Postal Service. Yeah. So I'm not seeing it in my house.
I see an Amazon dominance. I would say the UPS, the United States Postal Service is doing a little better than maybe, but within the madness that I see in our boxes piled up. Amazon is taking the high ground. Everything that's totally unscientific, folks. Don't hold me to that as well. We have Apple Computer. I can't believe any moment with Apple in 20 plus years where we've talked less about Apple on earnings day than today.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, here's a company, the stock, has really underperformed its technology peers, and I think the pressure's building for them to kind of give some more clarity on China and what the risk really is for them in China, what the opportunities are for them in China, because I think there's concern there clearly, and the stock is down about 4% year to date, and over the last 52 weeks up about 28%.
We welcome all of you across America. On Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, Sirius XM, a special good morning to a somber 99.1 FM in Washington, up to 92.9 in Boston. It was good to see, too briefly, the mayor of Wichita, Kansas, Lily Wu, speak as well in a difficult morning. Our Tyler Kendall, Anne-Marie Horton leading our coverage from the shores of the Potomac at Reagan and across at the Air Force Base just to the east, across the Potomac from Reagan National DCA. We're going to try to get in here a short conversation on our economics as we get to the morning. Paul will have an eventful 10 to 12 noon as well. And joining us is Dr. Wong. Dr. Wong and all of Bloomberg Economics, Anna Wong has just been wonderful about guesstimating. I'm getting some noise, Anna Wong, off the GDP report. There's different ways to parse the core equation. What is the oddity you see in this second look at GDP?
I think the oddity is how is it that consumption could be growing at such a brisk pace of 4.2%, and the answer to this puzzle, I think, is front running, and there's front running in every direction. So there's front running on imports because we have very strong imports in November and December. At the same time, we have consumers also front running the tariffs, and we have seen reports in the University of Michigan Consumer Sentiment Index that suggest that households are pre-purchasing durables such as washing machines, household appliances ahead of their expected tariffs.
We're seeing
and
that,
cars as well.
Yeah, we're seeing that at the Keene household where there's a front running on Sephora. We're purchasing, we're getting out front here. I do want to point out, Paul, and you'll have this at 11 a.m., the President of the United States will be speaking from his briefing room on the crash in Washington. Paul?
Anna, talk to us about what you heard from the Federal Reserve Chairman yesterday in his comments. Anything unusual or just anything newsworthy from your perspective?
Yeah, I thought the most unusual thing is he struck a very politically neutral tone on the impact of tariffs and immigration in vast contrast to the December minutes. He kept saying that it's, in order to have a plausible assessment, you need more details. That's the line that he has kept all throughout. He's been remarkably consistent about that. But clearly the rest of the crew and the Fed staff were not on board with this guidance as the December minutes showed.
So is your expectation, or what is your expectation for the Fed for the remainder of this year? Will they ease? Will there be pressure to maybe even raise rates?
I think they're within the Fed, both Fed staff, the FOMC committee is grappling with how to deal with how to think about Trump policies. Whereas on one side, you have the Fed chairman who is kind of adamant that one has to be very cautious in that, in fact, tariffs has many nuanced impact on inflation. Possibly, it would not clearly show up in consumption prices. However, you have, on the other hand, other FOMC members and Fed staff who already have incorporated a very significant inflationary impact of tariffs in the baseline. So I think looking forward, I think Powell is on an uphill battle in terms of easing. He tends to have an easing bias, but I think the rest of the FOMC and the Fed staff is not on board. The Fed may risk over-tightening.
Anna Wong, out of Chicago, there's a guy named Richard Thaler, who I know took you to too many Cubs games. But the answer is there's a behavioral construct to all this led by the charge of Richard Thaler and maybe Steve Levitt of Freakonomics and others as well. How do you perceive the game theory of a Canadian response? It's not going to be one response. It's going to be, am I right in that we're basically into tit for tat economics?
You know, the payoff matrix for a trade war with U.S. is quite interesting because if none of our trade partners retaliate, U.S. actually unambiguously win. But if both sides retaliate, both loses. But the question is who lose more? And so the country that tends to lose more is the country that is more exposed to trade in their economy. And by that account, Canada is actually more open than the United States. So definitely, in terms of GDP hit, it's greater for Canada.
Anna, have you guys, in your Bloomberg Economics GDP model, which I know is famed, have you made any changes to reflect higher tariffs, maybe changes in immigration policy that may impact the inflation input?
Yeah, so immigration. So when you have less smaller, a reduced growth in population size, then you definitely have slower GDP growth. So that is an unambiguous impact, which we do bake in. So we have an assumption of 500,000 deportation, which led to a tenth of a percentage point off GDP growth. In terms of the tariff, most of the impact came from trade policy uncertainty. And we actually I think we saw a little glimpse of that in the GDP figure today. We see this fixed investment in non-residential area being more negative than expected across the board. And that's not just Boeing. That's clearly part of it is because of trade policy uncertainty.
Anna Wong, thank you so much. Greatly appreciate it. With Bloomberg Economics, important discussion there of what we see within our gross domestic product and real GDP and nominal GDP. Again, Carl Weinberg up at High Frequency Economics suggesting everything said and done, it was a little bit of a soggy report. I know Jan Hatzius at Goldman Sachs was talking that up as well. Paul, I think it's sort of important, and we didn't even cover it today with all that's going on with this sadness in Washington. It's important when a government collapses.
Yes.
Norway. I've only learned in the last 4 minutes that Norway, the government, has collapsed. That's the word the Financial Times uses. We say the coalition splits, but the answer is it's over the electric bill. John Farrell's been very good about this. The electric bills in England and Norway, we have no idea. We're arguing about eggs.
Yeah.
Like Alex Steele had a tantrum over brown eggs and white eggs and what they cost. And,
Didn't know there was a difference. Okay.
She's getting pasture-raised, grass-raised, fancy eggs, and they're like $12 a dozen.
I am. This is actually all true. A good guess, but true.
But none of it matters to when people are crushed by electric bills like in continental Europe.
I didn't know that. So.
And in Norway,
does this have to do with Russia?
No, I don't think so. No, okay. It's just Norway and the way they sell electricity across Scandinavia and the continent. But the answer is, I think we need to report that a coalition government in Oslo is separated out where now Labour will run the government. I don't want to they have nothing to do with Greenland and Denmark. I want to make clear on that. But nevertheless, it's a tangential story that we'll watch there. You and Alex, jump in here. You and Alex have a busy 10 to 12 noon.
Yeah, and it's been upended by the news we've had overnight with the plane crash. So we'll have further reporting on that going forward, as well as some of the earnings that came in last night from some of the technology companies and some of the earnings, including Apple, after the close today.
Yep, and also we have the nomination of Tulsi Gabbard to the Director of National Intelligence, her confirmation hearing. So we'll be taking that, particularly the Q&A part of that.
The president just moments ago at 11 a.m. I believe.
Yep, and we'll take that as well. We're going to take it all for you.
Please,
we got a lot of stuff.
Cover never in umpteen decades have I covered Apple less on a day of Apple earnings than today, ever.
And also, John, talking about Microsoft, I mean, it's like all these huge moves, but the macro picture and these details are so intense.
Yep.
As we wind it up here at the 10 o'clock hour, and again, the President of the United States scheduled for 11 a.m. with Alex Steele and Paul Sweeney, we need to say thank you, particularly in the frigid night of Washington, to Henry Horton and Tyler Kendall. They were the ones outside trying to assess on the site this horrific crash in Washington. A major shout out to your team. What an honor to speak with Captain Levy.
Yes.
I mean, that was
fantastic.
something. 40 years with American Airlines. He was just fabulous as well. But again, thank you. And a shout out again with Bloomberg Daybreak, Nathan Hager, who stayed around. He usually just exit his people, have them out the door.
Yeah.
You know, hey, Adams breakfast and all that.
Exactly.
But he stayed around today for us. So we
on the ground reporting.
appreciate that.
Yep.
We leave you with the Dow up 100. SPX up 0.5%, NASDAQ does better, up 0.6%. Alex Steele's waiting for a package from UPS.
Yes,
it may get there, it may not get there. We'll have to see. Their earnings come in light, to say the least. Again, thanks to the team for a terrific day of reporting on this terrible plane crash. We'll see you tomorrow from New York, from Boston, from Washington, and around the world. We're on YouTube. Subscribe to Bloomberg Podcast. Good morning.